And welcome to our Board of Supervisors special meeting on April 20th, 2021. I'd like to start the meeting off by saying today we are convening a special meeting of the Board of Supervisors. And this meeting is open to the public, subject to several rules and restrictions. So it's not only this meeting, but the meetings after this will have these same rules. First, in light of COVID-19 pandemic, and therefore required by the state of California's Department of Public Health, all attendees must comply with the state of California's face covering requirements. Copies of these requirements are printed out and available at the front door. On this email, the link is attached to the most current updated information on the guidance of face coverings for the California government and should be printed out and available in case anyone asks. Do you have these printed out, Edgar? Thank you. They are printed out in the entrance of our chambers. Per the state requirements, all attendees must wear face coverings at all times, and that is also an ordinance by San Benito County. If you do not have a face covering, there are surgical masks available at the front door. Edgar, do we have some there? Thank you. And if you cannot wear such a face covering, there are also face shields available as well, correct? Thank you. If an individual cannot wear a face covering for any reason, including medical or religious grounds, they must participate remotely. They can still participate, but it will be via Zoom or over the phone. Therefore, they have the right to say anything they like over the Zoom or on the phone. All attendees must further observe physical distancing requirements and maintain a 6-foot separation from one another. Due to these physical distancing requirements, in-person attendance and audience seating is limited and will only be available on a first-come, first-served basis, except for those presenting at the meeting and the members of the media who shall have priority. I should further explain that the county, as a political subdivision of the state of California, must follow the rules adopted by the State Department of Public Health. As an employee, the county has an obligation to provide a safe workplace for its employees. In conformance with these and other occupational health and safety rules and regulations. Any violations of these aforementioned rules shall constitute the disruption of this meeting and shall be grounds for removal. Once again, all violations of these aforementioned rules shall constitute a disruption of this meeting and shall be grounds for removal from the meeting, closure of the meeting to the public, and other enforcement action. Thank you for your anticipated cooperation. Now, if you would please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, and that will be by Supervisor Peter Hernandez. Oh. Peter, are you on?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Ready? Salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Acknowledge the certificate of posting.
I so move.
Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
5-0.
Aye.
5-0, motion passes. C, a notice of temporary procedures for Board of Supervisor meetings. Ms. Assistant Madam Clerk.
Good morning, Chairman. Good morning, board members, and good morning, community members. Members of the public who are present in the chambers who wish to speak during public comment periods, please raise your hand and wait to be called up to the podium. If you wish to make a comment through Zoom, please press *9 on your phone or the raise your hand icon on your screen. We recommend that you upgrade to the latest version of Zoom to make sure you can participate through public comment. Each speaker will have 3 minutes to speak. Thank you.
At this time, is there any public comment?
You have been unmuted. Please state your name and you have 3 minutes.
Hi, my name is Susan Logue. I'm a resident of Hollister. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. I'm also a president of the Friends of the Library. I wanted to inform the public and also thank the Board of Supervisors for their support of the library. But just to be sure the public knows how much is being done at the library, I thought I'd give them some information. Right now, the library has online adult reading literacy. They also have curbside pickup and zip books during their bilingual story time, which will be, tomorrow, and then again on the 22nd, they will have Banana Slug Band. So all you have to do is call the library at 831-636-4107 or go online to SBCFL, which is San Benito County Free Library.org, and you can find out more information about story time and participating in the Banana Slug Band. Should be very exciting. Also on April 4th through the 10th was National Library Week. So if you haven't had a chance to go to the library's website, please go and check out the staff. It's very interesting. They put up a picture of each staff member and what they do. So it was really cool. They also have a State of America Library article, which talks about how much libraries have been resilient and determined and innovated during this difficult time. Also, the library's digital services have been greatly increased this past year. Electronic material checkout in 2019 was 6,000 items. In 2020, it was 19,000 items. In the website visits in 2019 was 119,000 visits. This year, past 2020, was 147,000 visits. So please feel free to call the library if you need any information or contact the Friends. We have a website at sbcfriends.org, or you can visit our Facebook page or find out more information through the library's Facebook page. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
No more comments.
Okay, we'll bring it back to the board here. We don't need any manager updates or...
No, just a special board meeting today.
We'll just go to the regular agenda. We'll let Mr. Ray Espinosa take it from here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, board. Thanks for attending today. Appreciate that. Today's a special meeting, and today what we're going to be discussing with your board is budget status, where we're at. I know with the loss of Stuart Patry in our budget office, we had some concerns about getting the budget done timely. We were fortunate enough to hire Gabriel Orozco. I'd like to invite him up. He is our budget analyst, and he's going to be presenting to you today. Oh, time's up. We're done. We're done, Mr. Chair.
For you.
With that, I wanted to just highlight that we're going to be discussing quite a few things today, but it shouldn't be an all-day event. Should be probably half a day, ending between 11 and 12. But we are going to discuss with your board timelines, planning process, revenues, funding, and source of funding, where it comes from. We're going to partially make this a little bit educational for the board, for the new board members, and also to provide a solid status report of where we're at and where we're trending. I think that's really important for your board to understand where we've been and what we've done and the issues that are in front of us and how we're going to be able to tackle some of those things. So with that, we also have our RMA director, Benny Young, and he will be presenting the second item on the agenda, dealing with our CIP. So he's put a robust presentation together. I want to thank him and his team for that. Very well done. And we look forward to that presentation as well. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and hand it off to Gabriel.
Thanks, Ray. Good morning, board members, chairman. Thank you for taking the time to come out here and for our special budget meeting. Budget being such a big part of the county, it does kind of demand its own special time. And like Ray mentioned, hopefully we won't keep you guys too long. We'll cover a broad range of topics stemming from the budget timeline to some revenue projections, to some requests that we've been receiving from some of the departments, to looking at our CalPERS and pension, how those are looking like, looking at some current accounts and looking at how we're trending from the past historically and how we're looking like going forward. And then we're going to round off by finishing with a presentation by Benny Young and the RMA department, because one of the big items that we do here at in the county and that we really want to nail down is our infrastructure, whether that be roads, IT, building a new library, or remodeling existing buildings, just to make sure that they're compliant. So that's kind of like a brief little overview of everything that we're going to kind of be covering. The first thing that I actually want to touch with the board and make sure that everyone, even the community, is aware of is within the county website, we have a budget and finance page under government. So if this is showing correctly, you guys seeing the...
Can you make sure that he's sharing it, please? Thanks.
So within the county budget website, there we go. So within the county budget website, we have our county budgets, the ones that we've been able to accumulate over the course of the years. The most current one that we have up is the 2021 budget, which was the one that was presented last year. And what I want to do with this, thank you. So what I want to do with a little bit of the beginning kind of introduction is bring up what the final product or a culmination of the budget process looks like towards the end of the year. And this is a brief and, like Ray was mentioning, some educational material for the board and for the community, so they're aware of the resources that are out there for them to access, so they can see what the county is budgeting towards different areas in the community. The one that I'm going to look at is this recommended budget. So this is using our new, well, not new, we've actually been with this new company, OpenGov, which is helping make the budget presentations and the budget more transparent for the community and the departments and everyone involved. So this OpenGov software, what it does is it helps makes the budget more accessible, so everyone can really get in here and take a look at different departments, different resolutions, budget policies. So one of the first things that I'm going to cover within here is looking at a citizen's guide to the budget. So this is, like I mentioned, the budget is a piece of the community. It's out there for the community to see all the services and all the different projects and programs that we're implementing. The citizen's guide here gives a pretty nice kind of rundown of information of what the budget is, different kind of topics within the budget, or different kind of items. So for example, what is budgeting? Budgeting is the process by which San Benito County Board of Supervisors decide on how to use its financial resources to fund services and projects that benefit the county residents. The process is complicated because, unlike private businesses, San Benito has a broad range of responsibilities. It has to be accountable to its citizens, the state, the federal government, and also, unlike private business, the county does not have the flexibility to drop services because they are not profitable. So essentially what the budget is we're trying to be as resourceful with the amount of funding and resources that we have, making sure that we can allocate those sets of resources to the maximum amount of its efficiency, whether if it's allocating to go towards roads to make sure that we have infrastructure improvement in our community, to say it's going towards funding the expansion of the jail or to remodeling certain facilities that are in need of upkeep, or putting it towards funding programs for the community like the block grant, not like the block grants, like the small business grants and some of the nonprofit grants that we're working with in the new funding. So this, is, like I mentioned, is a really good guide, gives a little overview of a lot of the different topics within the budget, revenues or expenses, looking at appropriate contingencies, reserves, funding. One of the big topics that we discuss a lot, and I think it's good for the community to also get a good understanding is essentially what are the kind of funds that we receive. So a lot of the time we talk a lot about general fund, but there's actually specialty funds. So, and these funds get funding from other areas, whether it's from the state directly or from the federal government. And some of these funds are very specific in what they can be spent in. So for example, going a little bit back to my background, so I come from the behavioral health side. So the behavioral health, we get funding from the federal government and the state, and some of this money is specifically allocated to be used in mental health to serve our community, to provide services, or to do capital improvements, or to begin doing a prevention, early intervention programs. So a lot of this funding is very selected, and the area of expenditure is very narrow, where it can be spent in. The funding that the county does receive that is pretty broad, and our expenditure is our general fund, which really acts as a backstop to a lot of different departments and a lot of the different areas of concern within the county. For example, we have a lot of concern with making sure that our roads are pretty kept up to speed, and a lot of the funding we have been putting towards a lot of these different areas. You know, sometimes we've also been putting funds towards making sure that our infrastructure, as in buildings and facilities, are maintained and up to speed with everything. So funding comes from a lot of different areas, and we need to manage it very direct and very specifically, and make sure that everything is accountable and we are able to provide everything that we can and use those resources to the maximum of our ability. So like I mentioned, going a little bit back to this website, we have, it really goes through in depth into a lot of the different areas that we touch on in the budget. Because a lot of the time, if you were just to pick out a select piece of the budget and just look at it, it might have a lot of different terms or areas that might be a little bit confusing or hard to understand. And essentially, this does provide a very good detailed guide on a lot of different areas so the public and everyone can take a look at. The next piece that I wanted to check.
If you go back to the main page on that as well, board members, when you look at that is the recommended budget that we would be, that we're actually working on currently, and we'll be providing a recommended budget to you in June timeframe. And that's what this is. This is a kind of a depiction of that. And if you go back to the main page, Gabriel, where you actually have the three to choose from on the budget page, go back, there you go. Then you have your adopted budget, you have a supplemental as well. So when you look at the adopted budget, you go ahead and look at that quickly, you'll see a depiction of the schedules. And it's a lot more specific to the actual schedules, the 1 through 15 schedules. And that is an outline of what those schedules depict. It's it's basically the fund balances. It's the enterprise funds, the internal services funds. All of those are represented through schedules, and this is strictly numbers. The other one has a little bit more information. You can actually look up where we're spending money. Are we spending money on salaries and benefits? What is that? And you click on it, and it's more of an intuitive. You can have a graph. You can pull a graph up. You can actually look at numbers and dissect them with the recommended budget through OpenGov, which we won an award last year through CSAC for that. We're one of the first counties in the state to move forward with a online budgeting system. So, but this right here is more of a depiction or more strictly associated with the actual schedules. So, go ahead, Gabriel. Sorry to.
No, you're fine. So like Ray mentioned,
Oh yeah,
When is the last day the budget can be submitted?
we were going to present that. You want to go ahead and state that?
One other quick question.
Okay.
How does the adopted budget and the recommended budget differ?
Well, they differ greatly in regards to the recommended budget comes from the CAO's office, and it's a lot of work that's done with the departments. When you actually adopt, the board will then adopt the budget. There may be some tweaks. It may not be specific to a it would be very close, and at times, I don't know if we've ever adopted as an exact copy of, I don't think we ever have. There's always been some changes to some extent. You know what, we need to have some more money in roads, or we need to have some more money in
disaster
reserves and some emergency fund, because, you know, we're not sure, we may be confronted with a disaster maybe. That's just, those are the things that come up, and then, and when we go through that process, then the board adopts it.
Sure. Okay.
And then we have to convert that into what you just saw. So there's a lot of work that goes into that. And then that gets approved. Hopefully that answers your question. Gabriel?
Yeah. So we, as being a government entity, need to put together a recommended budget and have it be brought forth to the Board of Supervisors by the end of June. So June 30th is the CEO's deadline to get a recommended budget to the Board of Supervisors, if not earlier. So we need to get this over to you, and the process then after the recommended budget going into, I'll cover this a little bit more in the presentation, but going into budget hearings, and then after those, then the board then formally takes the recommended budget with adjustments as needed. Like Ray mentioned, if we need to fund some obligations or put some money aside for some specific purposes, then we do that at that time. And then by the time the budget gets adopted, it's adopted with any kind of changes and adjustments we needed to make. And the final product is this report that gets completed by the CEO's office. This is then our adopted budget. And this, like Ray mentioned, has a lot of our schedules that are put together, looking at our fund balance, obligations that we have within the county, whether if it's our retirement pension, funding related to some disaster reserve funds. It also has more information on different financing sources that we receive, whether it's state, federal, fees and taxes and everything. It also gives more detail into the individual operations of the divisions and departments. So every single one of these schedules feeds into itself into the summary, which is the off funds schedule number 1. And this schedule right here pretty much is a culmination of everything. So this has our fund balance, our obligations, any additional sources of funding, the total funding uses at the end of the year, and everything, any increase and decreases in obligations. It's split, as mentioned before, into the different kinds of funds that we have set up. Specifically, we have the general fund, we have the special revenue funds, we have capital project funds, our debt service fund, and we have a couple other funds, our internal service fund, our enterprise funds, and then our special districts related to our CSAs. And other agencies that we have. So this essentially, at the end of the day, is our final adopted budget, and this is the biggest kind of culmination of the CAO's office, is getting all these different schedules and worksheets completed to make sure that everything is up to par and up to code according to the state's county budget book that it wants us to complete and abide by. And within that budget book, it has all the mandates and government code that we need to abide by, it being that For example, we need to make sure that we have a recommended budget to the Board of Supervisors by the end of June, and making sure that we're keeping two deadlines as they kind of come by. Like I mentioned, this is all amazing resources that we have available for the board and for the community, for them to kind of see, and this is all under our county website. So that's why I wanted to kind of touch and give a little bit of information on what the budget process is, a little bit on how the budget is supposed to look like at the end of the day, and making sure that the community and the board is aware of kind of some deadlines and some timelines that we have in place. So, without further ado, now I'm going to go to our budget here. So, now this is now my presentation. The beginning, like I mentioned, I wanted to make it a little bit educational for the board and for the community, so they're aware of some of the resources that we have available to access for everyone. So the first slide here that I'm going to touch on is our timeline. So the CAO's office at the beginning of the year works together to put together a timeline so that the departments know what our expectations are and our deadlines are for the budget, in case they're thinking about either, increasing personnel, maybe expanding their department, maybe looking at some capital improvements within their facility, or looking at any areas of concern. This is where they kind of begin to jot down and look at these days and make sure that they have more or less their kind of guide on what they need to do by when, and what they need to be complete in order to make sure that everything that they wish to be budgeted for and accounted for, they can make the CAO's office aware, so we can look at it for the budget. So right now we're halfway through our budget timeline here. So we're at our first special board meeting today on April 20th. Any adjustments from departments are going to be due April 30th. So any kind of requests, whether it be personnel or capital improvements or any adjustments to their proposed budgets, are going to be due to the CAO's office by the end of April. Soon after that, on May 18th, we have our second special board meeting. That one we're going to go into a little bit more detail, bring from the CAO's office some recommendations on some of the different requests that we're getting from the departments, whether if it's adding personnel to the roads crew, or adding more personnel to the sheriff's office, or adding more personnel to the library, or any of these areas where the CAO's office will push forward a recommendation which came from a department. Soon after the 18th meeting, like I mentioned, we kind of begin to put together a recommended budget, which needs to go before the Board of Supervisors by the end of June. In our case, our budget timeline, we want to make sure that we have everything in place a little bit sooner. The way that the government code has it, we can do it. It has to be before June 30th, so it can be any time before then. So the way that our timeline is set up, in the month of June is going to be some key periods for us to make sure that we have a public hearing and we have our recommended budget published to the public. And in June is where we have our public hearings, where the public can comment, as well as the board, on any items that we are recommending in the budget. And then soon after the public hearings, the board will then adopt a budget. And then that's what we will have going forward. Now, one of the reasons that we want to make sure that we adopt the budget before July 1st is making sure that by the time that date comes, if a department has needs, whether if it's adding some more employees or some more or some expenses that they need to take care of, by the time July 1st comes around, they're not held to, oh, the county still hasn't passed the adopted budget, so we can't begin the hiring process for this new personnel. We want to make sure by the time the new fiscal year beginning July 1st comes around, that the departments are able to begin to hire for new personnel, or purchase fixed assets, as in vehicles or anything that they might be needing to purchase at that time.
Mr. Chair, if I may as well, and it just makes life a little easier if we can do that. There is a way, though, to answer your question, Mr. Chair. The adopted or the recommended budget based on Section Code 29062 is required to have it June 30th or before that. That's our requirement. For the adopted budget, I think that was maybe your question, Mr. Chair. That is due on or before September 8th. Now, you may be asking yourself, why the difference in gap? Is there, what can be done? It just, there's, what Gabriel is saying is true. There has to be kind of a rubber stamp by the board to operate during the year from your board, and that's kind of what he's saying. In order to hire folks. I think that's really the kind of the key with this, is that if we do that, it allows department heads to continue to hire, to go through that process. If not, we have to leave everything status quo. And that takes, in order for the adoption to take place. So if we adopt it sooner, it allows us a little bit more flexibility throughout the year. If not, we have to go through some housekeeping to actually process hiring of individuals, which we can elaborate further at our next meeting if there's any questions or concerns with that. But I just wanted to share that. I think that was your question, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and so I wanted to highlight that. Now, yeah, I'll just leave it as that. Go ahead, Gabriel.
Yeah, so like Ray mentioned, making sure that we have it in by the first just makes it a very seamless transition from one budget year to the next year. So whereas departments that have needs are able to fulfill them as soon as possible. As soon as the new year hits, they're able to hit the ground running, put out hiring for new positions, or begin to work towards any projects that they're willing to or wanting to implement in the new year.
And one other thing to add, especially for the new board members, is there's a lot of requirements within the actual budget itself and the budget guide, and a lot of requirements by statute from the state. One, as an example, when we actually meet with the board during the budget hearings, there is an obligation that the auditor has to be present. So just for clarity, so you just need to, we wanted to mention that either the auditor or deputy designated by the auditor shall be present. So that's under Section Code 29083. So that's just an example of many, many other codes that we have to follow through the process. And obviously, legal keeps us straight at times and making sure that, we're doing that right. And we obviously work closely with the auditor. The auditor is actually going to be presenting at the next special meeting in May, which Gabriel will probably highlight a little bit more later. But, so we work closely with him. Unfortunately, he's out at a meeting right now. But with that, there's no obligation today. This is just a special meeting just to educate and the board and kind of give an overview of where we stand today.
Mm-hmm.
Gabriel?
Yeah. So the next slide here that I have is the purpose of this first special budget meeting. So this is kind of to provide an overview to the Board of Supervisors and to the community on some of the areas that we're focusing in on, looking at our budget, are we overspent, underspent, looking at a little bit on timeline, looking at planning, review some requests that we've been receiving from the departments, whether that be personnel requests, one-time fixed asset expenses, whether that's computers, cars, or whatever they might be looking to get, or whether that be looking at a more of a capital involved project, whether that's a new facility or an expansion or a remodel. So this is definitely the time where we're kind of collecting all this information to make sure that we can account for it in the upcoming year. We're also going to look a little bit into the budget policies and some information on revenue projections on how we're looking at right now and what we expect to see in the coming year. So touching a little bit on the timeline, the state controller, like Ray mentioned, we have a budget guide that the state controller provides, and this is pretty much just government code telling us what we need to follow. It gives us the structure of the schedules that I showed before, gives us the structure on what needs to go into which areas, and all the funding, how it needs to be split into general funds, specialty funds, reserve funds. So all this government code and regulation is in this county budget guide that the state controller's office provides. And that's pretty much is one of the most important books that I look at and reference, and making sure that I follow all the timelines and everything that's on there. So going back here, most departments have already submitted their budgets, whether it's making sure that they're making the CAO's office aware of any requests that they're wanting to implement this coming year. That also involves any capital projects, anything that they're wanting to do. The second special budget meeting we have coming up is on May 18th. There's going to be an additional presentation from Joe Paul and the auditor's office to go a little bit more in depth into our pension obligations and some more information into our trust that we have to make sure that we're covering our other post-employment obligations. And within that budget meeting, the CAO's office is going to come on board with some recommendations to the budget, whether that's adding some positions or in some instances beginning to maybe cut back in some areas where we're seeing that some resources aren't being utilized to its fullest potential. So that's the time that we're going to be coming to the board with. And then hopefully by then we'll have a little bit more of a finalized time schedule on some capital projects that we're looking at implementing in this coming year, whether that's putting more money towards roads or looking at, in the future, maybe looking at a library, an improved library, or maybe some improvements here in the general, into some of our buildings. So we, after that, in June, come across our budget public hearings that we have with our community. So like I mentioned in the timeline, June is going to be a really crucial time. There's a lot of kind of dates that go right back to back. A lot of those dates are mandated by government code, telling us if we want to have a public hearing, there needs to be a posting of public hearing. It needs to be 10 days before the day of the hearing, and different communication that has to be done with the community, because these are these funds are public funds, and the public is supposed to be aware of how we're spending it. Like I mentioned here, and also Ray mentioned out of the book, so code 29064A, the Board of Supervisors must approve a recommended budget on or before June 30th of each year. And then there are special considerations, which imply doing resolutions in case that we do get pushed back across that timeline. And if that does happen, we then would come to the board and make sure that we pass anything that's needed in order to make sure that we can continue to operate as a county.
So one thing just for clarity purposes on this, so as an FYI, if you could put that back on there again, the date. But with that, when you actually look at the date till June, that's a recommended budget. There has to be also the board to approve or adopt the budget. For a period of time, we have been adopting it in June. We've been taking it to the meeting and adopting it at that point. I think the last year or so with COVID and the uncertainty, we weren't sure if the state was had any changes, and so that is a very crucial element and part of this timetable here. When you actually look at the PowerPoint, if you can put the PowerPoint back on the screen here, the very top one is the State Controller's Budget Guide. And actually the page before, it actually highlights, actually it's going to be the next one, where we talk about the proposed budget, the 1991 realignment, 2011. So those factors in creating the budget are extremely important. And when COVID hit, there was a lot of uncertainty on how much money they were going to be able to fund, were they going to fund all of the 2011, 1991 realignment. There was a lot of just uncertainty. So we actually held that off a little bit in order, and then adopted it a little later in time. But so anyways, I just wanted to be clear with that. So once the adoption occurs, like in this particular year, 2021, We are operating under the adoption of the board's budget all the way till the end of this fiscal year, the end of June. So just wanted to be clear with that.
Yeah.
Gabriel?
Yeah, so touching a little bit on what Ray says, coming off this last year, there were some economic impacts related to COVID-19. It was managed accordingly by local, state, and federal government. And with that, in this new year comes a lot of planning and needing to observe what's kind of going on in our current situation. Looking at one of our kind of biggest pieces that we look at for guidance is the governor's January proposed budget, in which he had a lot of funding that he's dedicating this upcoming year going towards education, health, human services, and environmental services, whether that be looking at climate change and anything that's affecting in our current environment.
And that it can be a positive or it can be a negative.
So
If there's an unfunded mandate, or if there's items that they want us to operate, but they're not funding it, that becomes a problem for us.
So revenues that are coming in from whether it be the state or federal, let's say FEMA money, for example, or money from the, the CARES Act, is that put in that's listed as a receivable on the books? How is that
we
handled?
do, depending on it depends on when we get notice. It depends on, and we usually will put it on into the budget. I think we did that with the CRF funding. We actually budgeted the CRF funding.
If you know it's
If
coming
we knew it
for
was
a
coming,
show,
and
for
then we
sure.
budgeted for it, yeah. But there may be times where it comes in mid-year and we didn't actually budget for it. So we'll have to do augmentations, or we can do something special in that regard.
And how do you handle it if it carries forward into the next year? Sometimes these revenues, they may not come in for a year or two from what you've told me. That carries forward, that receivable?
It depends. I would say yes, it does, but I don't know. I'll leave that up to the accountant staff.
So for example, one example that you're bringing up could be some of the FEMA money. So for example, FEMA is very diligent in the time that it takes to kind of go through a lot of the expenses, because they have to make sure that everything that we're submitting to FEMA is FEMA reimbursable. Does it qualify within a FEMA expense? And with them going through pretty much their review panels, we submit everything, they review it, they then do go through multiple reviews, making sure that everything on there is appropriate and correct. And that's not even the end of the road, because after they review it, it then has to go through different approvals to get the funds to the county. And when that takes a little bit longer, and most of the time it does, it carries over into it being an expense, or I guess it's an expense that happens when those programs are implemented, but the revenue to cover that, which is the FEMA reimbursement, won't come in until way later on.
Yeah.
And that could be across the fiscal year, whereas 1 year you could be operating without that funding, so you're in a way eating out of some of the remaining fund balance within the general fund or any of these other funds.
You're going to see that in the slide. You're going to actually see that, and that's actually a good point. And that's the reason why, with the Great Plates program, that was one of the big concerns.
Yeah.
Is
So does it show as when you, at the end of the year, do you show it as a deficit, or?
I guess the answer is going to be it depends. It depends on when we receive funding. It depends on, it really depends. And we're hoping that in this case with FEMA, we're hoping that they give us a letter and saying, yes, you can account for the revenue for the year, which then is good for us in our books. But if we don't, then all of a sudden you have a huge negative, and then we'll make up for it obviously the following year. But for that year, it's really going to have a huge hit. And then if we're actually going out for a COP, or we're going to go through the SMP process for a rating, that becomes a negative. And that can have an impact on our actual rates. So that's why it's really important that we're mindful of that throughout the budget process and throughout the year financially.
Just in your world, Bob, it's similar to a liability sitting on in your balance sheet with projected revenue that you're anticipating, but you can't tell the banks that, oh, I know this is gonna be zero because I'm gonna receive these funds. So it's similar.
Right.
It's similar to that. So it's a
Yeah.
liability in your books from
Right.
your business.
Right, and so in terms of your ratings, is that where reserves are critical in terms of, you know, showing that you have the backup.
There's a lot of, yes, so reserves are taken into account, policies are taken into account. You know, proper
Obligations.
accounting is taken into account. There's a
Any
lot
pending
of factors.
obligations that we have, whether it be with our retirees or anything outstanding, any kind of big ticket items that we have. For example, like they take into account any debt also that we do have. For example, the COP that we have with the jail or anything like that. They take into account all these factors. They also, for example, take into account any new economic development happening within the county, just to make sure, are they seeing that the county is going to continue to be prosperous and grow? Is there some, because there's so many different factors that they drop into. They probably even factor in the county's, the age of the population. Is there a lot of retirees that are kind of there? Is it a younger working population? Is a lot of family and kids kind of more of a community dwelling? So a lot of these different factors, and they all really impact the rating that we get, whether if then going out to the S&P to bid out for other projects that we want to do out in the future. These are all, you know, very crucial factors that come into play.
And there's times too.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Supervisor Hernandez.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry to cut you off, Ray. Yeah, I think within the context of what I'm hearing, it really, because there's so many variables when it comes to the rating, it in my estimation, from just even going through this budget cycle the second time around, what I'm starting to grasp is the reality of a kind of a big global perspective on how we apply the budget process and making and from what I've learned, which I think is the wisdom of the board, is they've always played it very, very conservative because there's so many fluctuations. And we have technically a different dynamic because of the relationship with the state. So, you know, I think Ray clarified it really well when he said that if we get a letter confirming that we're getting these funds, I don't know how much value that adds to the rating, but I know that at least gives you confidence that the budget is going to be reimbursed, and maybe with some specificity as far as when it's going to be reimbursed, so you can amend the budget accordingly. Those are my thoughts, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, and that's when the auditing team can address that through the CAFR process and actually account for that. So there's definitely that, and it is, you know, I've sat on, you know, many different kind of I don't know if you call it a board meeting with S&P, but you go through the process. You can explain the process. You can say why, but still. They like to see it in black and white. At the end of the day, they want to look at that, and they take in all the factors that Gabriel and I just mentioned, and probably even a little bit more to address the rating. Which we had a good rating, a AA, which is fantastic. Behavioral health building, I think it was a little bit over 2.4%, I believe it was. So that's fantastic on the actual rate for that building. So that's, you know, it's really. You know, good news for the county because it's really a savings to the community, the taxpayer, ultimately.
Right.
Go ahead, Gabriel.
All right, yeah, so jumping back into it, so the governor's budget proposal in January carries a lot of different kind of implications, letting us know what we're looking like in the future, where he's kind of targeting some of these expenditures. And like Ray mentioned, a lot of this funding is tied to our departments that receive funding from the state directly. Apart from the general fund, and if there's a fluctuation within that set of funding, and they have, for instance, a drop, then in order to make them whole, that funding needs to come from one area or another. Most of the time, it ends up coming from the general fund to backfill any of these kind of drops in revenues in any of these areas, and that's one of the things that I wanted to address, and we'll see it in one of the coming slides in some of the revenue forecasts where that could be a little bit of a concern, but it's something that we'll kind of manage and we'll see going forward, because in the month of May, the governor submits a revised budget for the year. So during his May revise, and then at that point, we'll look at it, and the state will have a little bit of some better adjusted numbers on what our revenues are going to look like for a couple of the different areas, whether if it's AB 109, 2011, or 1991 realignment, or some of the sales tax that the state collects. Another kind of area that we look at to make sure that we plan accordingly is looking at our local sales tax and our property tax. Two of the biggest kind of revenue streams for the general fund, and making sure that if we are in, like I mentioned before, working on subsidizing some of the drops in revenues in other departments that make sure is the general fund going to be okay? Do we have a fund balance, or do we have an increase that can counteract the drop in another funding source? So taking all these different factors into consideration, there's also through a couple points on here, we are going to be receiving some funds from the federal government in the forms of the American Rescue Plan. We're going to be receiving about 6 million of them, pretty much postmarked to specific kind of projects in areas that they want us to work on. They will have a lot of kind of laws and restrictions around which areas we can spend these funds on. And a lot of it still hasn't come in through the federal government yet. We are kind of every single day checking in on the U.S. Treasury, which is going to be releasing the funds to make sure that we're aware of any new changes or updates that they're making. So for example, the U.S. Treasury just declared a couple days ago that they're going to be creating a specific department within the U.S. Treasury to manage these funds that are going to be sent out to the localities, the tribal governments, the state and the local governments. So they're going to be managing all these different questions and inquiries that different local governments and communities have about some of the restrictions that this funding is going to have. And then hopefully when they provide more information and they have that going, we'll probably get an ad hoc committee going with some of the board members to make sure that we can formulate a plan on how to properly spend some of this money that we're going to be receiving. Last point that I have on here is the coronavirus funding that we received this last year, and some of the funding that went towards a lot of different programs out in the community. The next item here that I have is looking at some of the general fund revenue that we have. I have a couple of years of actual revenue that we've received, and we have our original estimate that our previous budget officer had projected at around this time last year, and then I have our revised estimate looking at what we're potentially going to be looking like at the end of the year. It's looking like we're going to be at a net positive at the end of this year from our original estimate. So we're going to be probably doing a little bit better on some of the revenues that we're going to be receiving, but not by a lot. And what that means then going forward is then I factor in our growth over the last couple of years, and then looking at how San Benito County is growing and developing, and then trying to estimate what is an appropriate number of growth kind of going forward. And that number for this instance, for this next upcoming year, ends up being $719,000 in these revenue streams. So like I mentioned, these are kind of like the bread and butter of revenue for the general fund, and it's the ones that we look at very intensely just to make sure that if we are approving different projects or positions or anything within departments that we're aware of, offsetting amounts, or if there's any obligations coming up that we see, okay, if a new obligation is coming up, do we have enough revenues coming in or increases in revenues to offset that?
So just one thing to add before we go to the next slide on this, I just wanted to share with you the first item there, property tax. When you actually look on that, there has been a continual growth, anywhere from 5.5% to 7%. And so when you look at that, that's what we work with. We work with Tom's office, Tom Slavich, our assessor, that does the evaluations of property within our community. And obviously there has been a growth, there has been housing building, and there's been a lot of other things that have actually occurred. So with that, when you look at that on that screen, you'll see that it's about $500,000 from the revised estimate to the estimate itself, $600,000 plus obviously the Prop 172 and so forth. So we're looking at about $700,000 increase. But unfortunately, a few pages down, you're going to look at a obligation of just CalPERS as an example. So we'll share with that a little in a little bit here. But Gabriel, go ahead and go to the next slide.
Mr. Chair?
Go ahead, Supervisor Hernandez.
Yeah, thank you. So Gabriel and Ray, and I know we've talked about this before, some of the blessings that we've had in our county, to a certain extent has been the curse of other counties, is they have a lot more flexibility because of increases in revenues. As an example, Monterey has a huge tourism industry, And when they had big losses because of the shutdowns, that you ended up having these, basically the tourism industry really shrink. And I heard there was major layoffs, and we didn't have to go through that. And ultimately, not for any other reason, but because we've always played it conservative with our revenue stream. So to me, the biggest thing that really stands out is, although we haven't had major increases, we've been steady, and I think it's part of it is definitely the attitude of the board to be very conservative. So my point is there's not a lot of flexibility in what we have, which means the budget is very sensitive in our community. We haven't had a downward trend. We actually did the opposite when times were tough. We the board actually gave a lot of flexibility with staff, and I know that there was some paid time off, paid basically work away from the office. So the bottom line is, I just wanted to point out that it really stands out to me that there's not a lot of flexibility with our budget, but just the same, as long as we play it, I think conservative, then there's a lot of value to be said that we still have a lot of potential for good things, assuming we still play it conservative, I guess. That's what I'm trying to put it. Thank you,
Mr. Chair, if I may, to comment on that. So I want to chime in on that, and I tend to agree with Supervisor Hernandez when he explains that we've been conservative. We have been very conservative over the years. Unfortunately, we're kind of reaching a crossroads where our expenditures naturally are actually becoming higher than the revenues that we're receiving, and our obligation of our infrastructure needs, or roads as an example that the board has been really advocating to address, those figures are rising dramatically, along with some of the infrastructure in our buildings and other things that we haven't been able to maintain regularly. And so with that, we're going to share with you a few slides that obviously we're seeing a different kind of a trend, and that's what we wanted to illustrate for you, the board, and how vital the economic development ad hoc and staff working on options to generate more revenue is going to be over the next year and two, really years. The few years that we have here are going to be critical for our county, because we don't normally see the revenues right off the bat. We see them down the road. And those are, it's going to be really critical and key. Also to look at, obviously the feds are putting packages together for roads. There's a lot of potential options that we have there. I know in the case of the cities, this package that is before us coming up, the American Rescue Act, there's an avenue for them to get whole again by their losses from TOT and some of their sales tax. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of sales tax that we generate in the unincorporated area. So that doesn't really apply too much. It will. We'll have some, there'll be some money that we can extract from the American Rescue Act to account for some of our losses, but it's not the millions, maybe like some of the cities, maybe in city of Monterey or Carmel or some of these other areas where there's a lot of TOT and other losses from sales tax. Gabriel?
Well, I was just going to comment. Anyone who's been in business knows that one thing that is a truth in business is that expenses always go up, and so if you're not moving forward in revenues, you are going to ultimately be in a bad position because expenses will always rise. You can never just I hear people say, why don't we just maintain the status quo? You just can't do that because this is a business and your expenses are going to rise. So you have to increase revenues. Yeah. It's ironic we benefit this year. We're not hurt as much because we have such limited revenues and we're not tied to sales. We have so limited sales tax revenues that it's actually, benefited us in a way, right. But it's not a long-term, it doesn't work in the long term. I was going to ask a question. I was just looking at, so Gabriel, I was looking at, the website, the county website, and I was looking at the 2020-21 recommended budget, and under all funds, I'm just trying to get a feel for this. It shows revenues of 161 million, a little bit over that. It shows the expenses of 194, and so it shows I guess a deficit or a difference of $32 million. Now, how much of that $32 million is, and I don't need exact numbers, I'm just asking in general, is because of the way that money flows in, what we were talking about earlier in terms of, there's receivables out there. How much is it that, there's on the books, the money that has to be allocated for, for CalPERS or PERS. So I'm just curious, I mean, is that generally true? You're always going to be potentially on the books, you're going to show potentially a negative balance, even though maybe financially you're in very good shape. I'm just curious how that.
Yeah, and
all plays out.
without actually looking at that, and I don't know, Gabriel can chime in. There's multiple factors with that. One is, I think, what you just said. But historically in the past, the CIPs have been accounted for, and not they've been accounted for, and ultimately we haven't actually executed those. So it's showing on the books that we're budgeting for it, but we don't have the funding for it a lot of times. So that's also been an issue, which Benny, I know, is working on that, where we're going to present projects that we can fund. And so that'll lower that ceiling down quite a bit. So historically, that's what has transpired. And a lot of times we'll look at that, we'll look at the funds. I mean, it could be, you got to keep in mind, there's bridges, there's other things from impact fees that we have all tied to the overall budget. That accumulates subvention funds, that accumulates the general fund, which is a small portion. That's not all the general fund. We have projects, as an example, with the jail still being built, the behavioral health building. Those are all very large projects. All those are accounted for within our budget. Now, it just depends on the process, where we're at in the time, and what part of that project where we're at, and that's what is being accounted for at that particular time. But you keep in mind, those projects can last 2-3 years.
Yeah, right.
4 years. So they go over a period of fiscal years, multiple fiscal years.
And you.
Mr. Chair,
And just FYI, so I don't want to be getting into Benny's presentation. Benny will be presenting the CIP. He'll elaborate on some of these projects and discuss some of the funding as well associated with that.
Right. And I know that, this is one area that's really different from, let's say, a business that I ran, where on a yearly basis, you obviously don't want to be in a negative position, because that's actually hitting the books.
Right.
Whereas this is a much more involved with things that you're carrying forward. And I know Supervisor Hernandez wants to speak as well, but when he's done, I'm just curious. Also, in my business, my past business, cash flow is always a huge issue. Now, I gather that is not a big issue, because a lot of these expenses are, they're accounting expenses, but they're not actually being spent in that particular year. So anyway, I'm just curious about cash flow.
Additionally, it could be the cost plan, A87 cost plan. So 2 years is when we pick up the funding, when it actually executes down the road.
Yeah.
So we're doing the work this year. So county council is doing work for Health and Human Services. They bill them this year. Do you know when they get paid? They get paid 2 years from now. Wow. So, cash flow, timing of when things are done, how we actually model that. We're not we're not an ISF county in particular. Some ISF counties, they do the work that year, they do the work that month, they get that accounting actually, they get paid that year. For us, it's a cost plan, and in my opinion, I worked with the auditor's office for years on this. I almost sometimes feel it's a black box at times, because a lot of times it's all the data that we provide for them, and then they do a calculation on whatever that ratio is of the work that's being done. And And again, we get reimbursed 2 years in arrears. So, yeah, it's complicated, and there's a lot to it. All right, sorry, Gabriel, go ahead, continue.
It's not a net 30, okay? It's a net 710. Supervisor Hernandez?
Yeah, but thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and I would add to that it also doesn't account for the cost and increases in construction, right? And that's why there's budget amendments even through that process. So, but aside from that, I think it kind of makes for a good argument on why the unfunded mandates really puts us in a deficit year after year, because there's requirements from the state that ultimately don't come with funds with it. And it's not even just the funds, it's the time that needs to be put in. So it assumes a whole lot of negatives, really, because it says you need to do this, which is going to be more work for staff, and it's also going to cost more money that we don't have. So on two ends, we're basically being hit hard. So to a certain extent, I feel like this makes for a good argument on why we, and I hate to deflect, but yeah, I think makes an argument for why a lobbyist is really important on dealing with unfunded mandates to the legislature to really start backing off. And either that or you ultimately create some kind of protections for small counties like ours that don't have that flexibility. So maybe we have a lot more local control, one or the other. You back off on legislation or you give more local control. That's just my thoughts, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Gabriel, continue, please.
Thank you. So continuing on from those revenue projections, this next slide that I have up is the 2011-1991 realignment. Estimated early forecast for this year. Going back to how we kind of grew actually from last year. So from fiscal year 1920 to 2021, 2011 realignment grew by 5.2%. So this is money that goes towards behavioral health, health and human service, our probation, sheriffs, district attorney, and public defender. So this is money tied into some of the general fund departments. And if, for instance, in this coming year, the state governor's office is projecting a 2.4% decrease. So what that means is funding for some of these departments, for example, probation and sheriff, may decrease by a small amount. And if, for example, they are wanting to increase personnel in one area or another, then the general fund might be needing to come in and back up some of these increase in expenses. The other source of funding that I have on this page is 1991 realignment. Funding for this is for public health, behavioral health, health and human services. This one is also projected to decrease about 1.2% from fiscal year 2021 to 21-22. So these are all different factors that we're really looking at and trying to dial in to make sure that we understand them and make sure that our forecasts are kind of coming in okay, so we can kind of calculate any deficits that we might be looking at, small or big, in these areas. So this next one, I wanted to give the board like a really thousand-eye view of the current general budget, how we budgeted, what our current numbers are, and kind of some of our projected final numbers. If we look at the bottom box here, we have that our projected final cost is looking like a deficit of $3 million within the budget amount that we had budgeted at the beginning of the year. What this means, it doesn't mean the county is going to be a negative completely. We do have a fund balance that the county is able to kind of dip into and cover some of these increase in expenses. And a lot of these expenses have been expenses tied to funding that hasn't come in yet. So for example, we had funding for some of the FEMA programs from Great Plates, some one-time relief funding that we put aside to go towards roads. So because of the weather phenomenon that we had in early January, where some of the roads got washed out, and we filed a disaster form with the Office of Emergency Services at the state level, the OES, to make sure that they're kind of aware that these are all kind of expenses that we're going to be kind of fronting and trying to cover some of these costs. But at the end of the day, we have yet to receive some confirmation from them, whether in the form of a letter telling us that funding is going to be coming in down the line. So in terms of my numbers that I show here, it's showing a $3 million deficit at the end of the year. But for example, if FEMA comes in and says, oh, we're going to reimbursing you, here's here's the attestation letter saying that you guys are going to get paid on this date. If it's within this fiscal year, it'll show it as a revenue. If it's going to be showing it, if it's going to be coming in the next year, then it'll be money coming in the next year to cover for prior year expenses. One thing that, though, that this kind of puts like a big picture on is looking at our fund balance. So our fund balance is what we've been able to kind of dip into these last couple of years to kind of supplement any kind of increases in expenditures above and beyond increases in revenues. So if you have increases in expenditure, you want to make sure that you either have revenues increasing at that same pace or even higher in order to make sure that you have something sustainable for the future. And if you don't, then what you end up doing is eating into some of these fund balances.
So just for clarity purposes on this, historically, what we've done and instituted, the county has had difficulty hiring staff. It's been an ongoing concern and issue for years now. And what we decided to do as a whole is to address our vacancies and allowing the departments to still have the opportunity to go out and recruit. And why you'll see here in a few minutes the actual salary. I mean, you have the salaries and benefits are budgeted much higher than the actuals because there's that gap. It's about a 20% vacancy rate, which is extremely high, so that's how we have been budgeting this, and we usually ended up historically in the black. Last year, we've had issues with roads. There's a landslide. There was a lot of things that came up, and
One-time events.
we were off a little bit with that. But again, the same thing, or the year before. Then we have COVID now. We have just this tremendous amount of issues with roads. We've been putting money into roads out of the general fund. So we've had to deal with a lot more emergencies and other things that have come up that actually impacted our fund itself, our fund balance. But there is some light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to being reimbursed those funds as well. And that's what we're working on from a staff perspective.
Mr. Chair. How would so we have the $7.8 million reserve, and I know there's some other reserves that are restricted. Is there any anticipation level of when we may find out about I know it's a big question mark, but the $3 million, we talked about potentially spending down some of the general fund reserve on roads potentially next year. So how would the timing impact that prospect?
Yeah, and that's something that we need to look at. If you want to move it, let's go to the next slide. I think if we can go ahead and have the person in the back turn on the slides. Can you have him turn it on?
Do you want to look at the past?
The PowerPoint, yeah, if you can. We have a new system now, and so we're not, he has control of it, which we need to address. But in any case, let me just kind of, for just a talking point, go ahead and go to the next slide. Go one more. Yeah, so when you see this downward trend there, there's some money there that I think you had talked about for the $3 million. Actually, let's just take a picture of this. This is the $12 million. We have been more or less raising that. When I first started, we were really low, almost zero, and that's gradually increased. Mm-hmm. But then we had the jail. There was quite a few. We had over $10 million that the county put in, obviously, over a period of time, and there were some in-kind funds and other things that were allocated. But there's definitely that. We also had roads that we've been put into, landslides. I know that there's been increased cost in legal. There's just been CalPERS. It's just everything across the board. Things have increased in cost, and we also did a change in accounting on that 1 year to better account for that. So that's why that number is kind of a significant number. So it's a combination of both those things. These last two items, 7 mil to 4 mil, is what you just saw a few minutes ago. And again, there is still a tremendous amount of things that we have been putting out. We don't have, though, in there, which I wanted to highlight for you, because I think you just brought this up, we have tobacco tax of $4 million in a restricted reserve that can be pushed over into that figure. Okay? We also have another benchmark award home funding that we actually have for our annexation, and that's $6 million. So we have in a restricted reserve. However, we're not moving that yet until we address the legal side of things. So, and then we have some other potential revenue down the pipe. I know cannabis is one. I know there's a development in San Juan Oaks that potentially can generate some revenue on one-time funding. So there's some potential there of, just if we had San Juan Oaks, the benchmark, and the tobacco, that's about anywhere from, probably 16 million or so. And then we have, some other revenue possibly with cannabis and some other things that we may have. So it's not a lot, but there is potentially some more potential one-time money that we would have. I would say we have to wait on some of that before we can actually pull the trigger until we know for a fact that we actually have that money available. So hopefully that answers the question. But I don't think it doesn't really. I can't give you a specific date, but it definitely there's opportunity.
What is recommended as far as having in reserves? I'm sure there's guidelines that the state lays out, and if you fall below that, then you're in potential danger. Is there a percentage, or there must be something like that?
Yeah, and that's there is. We actually had that in our policies. I know it was. I'm trying to remember, get the right numbers for you. Do you have it on your slides? You don't have it in your slides, do you?
Let me pull up the policies from.
Yeah.
Do you remember what the bonding company is on?
Yeah. So to answer your question, yes, there are recommendations. Is a GASB. There are some recommendations, but we actually have in our policies a number that we created this last year to kind of more align to that. And again, that can be discussed. We can bring policies back next meeting,
Right.
and highlight what the recommendations are, and then we can talk about that, and we could talk about spending some of the reserves, what we have
Right.
available for roads or other things.
Well, I know, we've been talking about the possibility, and I'm all for obviously addressing roads and some other areas, but also I think we need to know, what is the minimum recommended reserves? And I don't think one wants, being conservative, you don't want to fall below that, certainly.
Right.
Because that can affect your rating, and,
Yeah.
you don't want to put the county at risk. So, and I'm just curious.
Yeah.
One other, just to be clear on this general fund budget, that we're showing final balance of, $3 million projected final. But once again, it's misleading because, as
Yes,
you're
it-
just saying, Great Plates and all these other areas are
Yeah.
coming out of the general fund, but
Right.
we're going to, knock on wood, we're going to be reimbursed for those,
Yeah.
those funds. So
Right.
we're not really.
That's
I mean,
correct.
that's where it gets tricky, but
That's-
we're really not at a $3 million
That's right,
deficit.
and that's the point we're sharing with you. We wanted to make sure that you understood the full picture.
Right.
And where we're, and it's difficult because it depends, and it's a snapshot of time.
Right.
And this is what we see here, but once we get approved and we'll get the funding, then that number changes. But that could change in August, September of next fiscal year, or it can change in June of this year. It just really depends.
Right, it's a moving target,
Right.
but there's a big difference between being $3 million deficit in real money versus $3 million because of the timing
The
issue.
timing,
Yeah.
right, that's correct.
And I think we as supervisors just have to understand it's a fluid process until we get the letter of confirmation.
Yes.
When the money come in.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to ask as many questions as Supervisor Tiffany, but I do want to piggyback on his question. So going back to the recommended reserve, is it a percentage or is it a dollar figure that is normally set?
We'll do is let's make it clear. We'll come back with all of our policies, the reserve, are you referring to the fund
minimum
balance,
record, yes,
policies?
reserve that you're suggesting. So what does the policy state?
It's usually percentages.
Okay.
But we can bring that back, and what we'll do is we'll share with you.
Do you know what the percent, well, I'm sure you know, but it seems like you're reluctant to share that with
No,
me.
honestly, I don't want to give you a false answer because I don't remember it exactly, but we have it in our policies. Do you want to pull that up in our budget?
I was just
It's online. It's online.
I'm not a numbers person, you know. I'm more logic, and so,
Thought it was like 15.
yin and yang here.
Gabriel's looking it up right now online.
Yeah, I think it's 15.
Yeah.
It's my memory.
See, and that's good, just 12 to 15% is okay. I don't need a specific number, I'm good. It's just that I want to have something to hold on to. So say, for example, this is an exaggeration, but say, for example, our budget is, 100 million, 12 to 15, we know one number.
That's
And we
right.
can grasp it.
That's right.
Okay, so I'm good with that.
And what we'll do is, I think it brings up a very valid point. We should come back with all of those policies, and we can revisit them. And that's something your board can say, you know what? We want to use a little bit more, have, maybe a smaller percentage or, whatever. I mean, it's up to you. Or maybe have a little bit more. And due to, the worldwide crisis and just things happening every year, maybe we want to have a little bit more in reserves for that. So it really depends on your board, and it's up to your board to make that call.
Thank you.
Yeah. Continue on, Gabriel.
Yeah. One thing I did want to make sure that I got correct. So the $7 million fund balance that we show here is not necessarily restricted or reserved. It's a unassigned fund balance. So it can be used by any of the general fund departments in case they see a drop or an excess of expenses. The next slide here.
And I had mentioned some restricted reserves that eventually would be rolled into the unassigned, which would then inflate that number or increase that number. So, yeah.
Yeah. Once we have a little bit more
That's right.
information and clarity, there's no pending litigations or anything with that.
That's right.
Once we can actually recognize it. So, and then this graph, I think, kind of shows a little bit what Supervisor Tiffany was alluding to was what we have seen in the last couple of years is an increase in expenses. Whether this has been funding that's been pulled towards projects with roads or expenses tied to the building of the expansion in the jail. So, or just general expenses increasing within a department with increases in staffing or services and supplies. We have seen an increase in revenues, but as you can see from this graph, that gap still remains. And the gap is needs to be made up somehow. And the way that's been made up these last couple of years is by consuming some of the unassigned funds that we have had available in the county budget. And what this then does is it goes into our next slide. It decreases our fund balance that we have available to subsidize expenses in some of these different departments.
And just to emphasize and to highlight, it's more one-time money, more one-time issues, one-time items. We know we've been putting money into potholing roads. I think the last few years, $1 million each year. So those are just a couple of examples of more of a one-time kind of expenditure.
And some of those expenses, like Ray mentioned, since they are one-time, they're not tied in with the reimbursement or backing from any kind of other area. For example, so right now, like you guys have been mentioning, we're showing that our fund balance at the end of the year is going to be $4 million because we are going to eat up $3 million worth of expenses. Well, if we get word from FEMA or from the federal government, hey, we're going to be reimbursing you for some of these costs, then those would then be recognized revenues, meaning that $3 million deficit is probably be closer to $1 million or maybe
Zero,
close to
or
breaking
flat.
even. And if that happens, then we're not looking at somewhere of a drop in $3 million in our.
Status quo.
Yeah, we're looking at
From
something
last year.
status quo, looking like we're gonna be okay. But that's something that we're definitely monitoring, keeping track of, because we don't wanna keep trending downward. Because if we trend downward, then that limits us in our capabilities that we can do. We can't kind of be as flexible with our funding to make sure that we can fund all these different projects in the county. So that's something that we're definitely keeping an eye out on.
So, in light of timing, Gabriel, if you want to just continue on, but I think this is a very important slide, is that expense and revenue and the trend factor. And I think what you see there is that separation actually occurring, and we're going to share with you a slide from CalPERS that kind of highlights that versus what the revenues are that we're receiving from AV. They're not matching, along with any other expenses as well, or any other things, so.
Yeah.
So, go ahead, Gabriel.
Yeah, so just real quick, so going into our general fund increases, like I had mentioned briefly, our increase projection was 719,000. If then we jump to our increase in PERS obligation, so this is looking at now our CalPERS PERS impact, going from 2021 to 21-22, between the three different categories, we have a total pension obligation increase of $823,000 and some change. This increase in obligation is more than the increase in revenues that we're projecting for some of the general fund money this upcoming year. So what this means is that difference between the 700,000 and the 800,000 would need to be made up somehow, whether that's dipping into our fund balance, or if there's an increase in sales tax, whether we bring something in relations to cannabis tax. So we need to be looking at ways to offset and enhance our revenues to make sure that we're combating any of these increases. Because from this, you can kind of see that just from that increase in pension obligation from one year to the next, it's going to be more than what we're going to be seeing.
And nothing has changed. Nothing. It's just, that's our new obligation. So, and I think your board has taken that step forward, so I appreciate that, creating the ad hoc, the economic development ad hoc, and looking at opportunities with staff. That is crucial, and continually moving that forward.
Yeah. Sorry, I kind of jumped ahead on the presentation. I want to make sure that I tied those 2 points together.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriel.
The next thing that I want to kind of to present to the board is, and this is something that Ray mentioned, is kind of some of our employee requests from the different departments and looking at our current situation. So currently, we have 576 positions, both full-time and part-time. 559 are full-time, 17 are part-time. I have a breakdown of how many of them are filled, both full-time and then part-time. What we show here is we show over 100 positions, both full-time and part-time, which are vacant, meaning we have close to a 20% vacancy rate. And this is something that we're going to be looking at addressing. Like Ray mentioned, it does provide some flexibility in the budget for departments to kind of be able to go out there and hire, but what it does is if we budget for these positions to be fully staffed, it makes our budget look very inflated. And that gives the county a false misinterpretation in a way of it showing that we're going to be showing all these expenses when at the end of the day we're going to have a 20% vacancy rate. You're not really going to realize those expenses. And if we're able to kind of say, okay, we can change a little bit of the way that we do our budgeting related to some of the employee and the staffing positions, then that'll make it so our budget is a little tighter. We're able to predict our expenses a little better, and that makes it so if we want to do something with some of the funding that we kind of free up from doing some of this vacancy budgeting, we can then look at doing something with that. And then with that, we have some requests that have come in from some of the departments. So for example, we've had 15 new position requests from the general fund, 5 new positions from special revenue funds that don't impact the general fund. And my last bullet, I wanted to bring this up because this is something that we're going to be kind of bringing back to the board. and have some discussions with the board in relation to changing the way we budget for our staffing in our county.
And so when you consider that, you know, the things that we look for in administration is how many vacancies does that department have? They have 3, 5? And you're asking for more? Then we question that, we look at that, we analyze that. Is it maybe a specialty position that they're looking for, or something outside of what they currently have in the book? So there's a lot of things that we address when we go through this process. In addition to that, when you look at that number, you have 15 in the general fund side, that's probably 1.5 mil increase,
I have a question.
at least.
Going back to that 20%, how do we fall with surrounding counties in terms of having that 20% vacancy? And before you answer that, let me kind of just get on my soapbox here. I know that we are woefully understaffed. I know that the staff employees that we do have working right now are overworked, they're taxed. They're carrying multiple loads because, again, the shortage in the vacancy number and then the shortage of employees that are currently hired. But where do we fall and again, I know this is a budget, but wherever I can, tout what we're doing right. What can we do as a county to get out there to advertise this and recruit qualified, skilled employees so that we can all work together more effectively? But where do we fall 20% wise in comparison to other counties?
I did some research a while back. On the average, it's anywhere from 7 to 11%, on an average about 9-10%. Again, that was when we started this process. And our numbers were very close to that, probably 4 or 5 years ago, something like that. Interestingly enough, the last few years, the number has skyrocketed to double, 20%. So it's, I haven't looked at the numbers lately. Supervisor Gonzalez, we will take a look at that and get back to you on that.
Okay.
I can invite Edgar Nolasco. He is our deputy CAO. I'd like to invite him up to talk a little bit about HR, to answer your question about recruitment and what we're doing in that regards. Edgar?
Sorry for taking you off track, but it's just an important issue. I'm getting a lot of calls from, county employees about the concerns in their departments, and it just kind of segued right in nicely, so thank you.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the board. That is a great question, Supervisor. My recollection, I did come from Santa Cruz County. The way we would do budgeting is a little different. It ranges from, like Ray said, anywhere from 5 on the low end all the way up to 10. We are on the higher end of vacancy. We have been doing things to recruit employees. One of the things is we started marketing ourselves. We started our new website, sbchr.us. We really promote our jobs, what we have there. We've done ads, social media. We're working on better recruitment tactics. However, we are competing with the surrounding counties. One of the biggest concerns is salaries. Your board did address that recently. We did a class and comp study. We all the classifications that were under salary were brought up to salary, 90% to market. Those will be taken into effect as of September of this year. We should see better results from a recruitment standpoint, but we are actively working on new ways to recruit and retain talent here in our county. Also, we did admin and HR did sort of a think tank. We came up with a motto for our HR is work here, thrive here, and we were building, selling that point. One of the biggest things in recruitment is really marketing and selling yourselves. It's not always salary. One thing that puts us, and it is unique to us, as you come here and you thrive here. Yes, we may be a little bit lower salary, but you get to learn new skill sets where you don't stay in one position. You have people who promote and really climb up through the ranks. Your budget officer being one of them, being from Hollister, raised here in Hollister, goes to school, comes back, is hired as an accountant, promoted again, and then ultimately is here in front of your board as your budget person. So we're really trying to market those type of individuals that, we do have a little bit lower salaries than our surrounding areas. However, you can thrive here and promote, given the opportunities that may not exist at larger municipalities.
And there's other things that we're working on as well, and this year HR is spearheading this with the direction of your board and administration, the CAO, is to address our healthcare. That's been critical with our employees, and that's something that we are working hard at moving off of CSAC EIA into CalPERS, which would have a significant impact on the bottom line for our employees ultimately in a positive way. That'll relieve them of having to pay a higher rate. So I think that's really critical as well. So there's a lot of other things besides just the pay, but that's one really important
Oh,
piece.
I agree with you with the healthcare. I got sticker shock. I went for some labs, just typical labs. Went with Hazel Hawkins, and it was kind of like a physical. $1,000 for labs, and our insurance didn't cover anything because it was my first visit expense. They, of course, they reduced the rate, but if an average employee is looking at $555 for lab work, that is ridiculous, and so, but yeah, I do not like our medical plan at all. So all of you employees out there, I hear you, I feel you, I'm sorry, but sticker shock, wow.
Well,
So.
that's why you're being paid.
I had a question,
the big
Mr. Chair.
bucks.
Go ahead, Supervisor Hernandez.
Yeah, Gabriel, what is, or Edgar, what is the percentage of our budget, health, welfare, pension, and wages? What is the percentage of that? Like, how much do we pay of that?
Our total budget, on top of my head, I believe is around 65% goes into salary and benefits. The biggest percent being salary, then followed by pension obligations, then health, and then taxes, FICA, Medicare taxes. However, the presentation, if you guys recall, we did last to your board regarding, call it death by pension, is our labor costs. I believe it was 63 or 65% of our general fund budget is made up by labor.
So would you say in general, all of that total upwards of 80%?
When it's total budget, it would be much less, but general fund, I believe, on top of my head, is 63, 65%.
And that's including, that's payroll, that's health and welfare, that's pension?
Correct, total labor. What we were hoping to receive from your board approval to move on to CalPERS. Such a move wouldn't necessarily cost the county any more money. However, it would be, we did some forecasting. It would be a savings up to $600,000 a year for employees. So that's what we're really advocating on, doing more with less. And that's one of the things that your board gave us direction, and we're actively looking into going into CalPERS.
Say those savings one more time so
Yeah,
people
so
really understand.
$600,000 a year for employees. If we would move to CalPERS, what we did is we did an apples to apples comparison of our current demographics for 2021. We compared those to the rates that we know from CalPERS, and that gives us gives county employees that currently receive health from us about a $600,000 savings a year.
And I commend you, Edgar, for, I know you guys, and I know the county has worked really hard at managing the budget. The only reason why I asked that question, and it's kind of in line with, I know that the ongoing sentiment is we should be paying more, right, to be able to retain so that we're not losing people. I think it's a lot harder than just paying more, because we're basically always competing with Northern California. I'm not opposed to coming up with some kind of a plan that creates incentives that folks can't take with them, right? So if they move on, they don't take that benefit with them, like some kind of housing or whatever. But that's just off topic. My point is I feel like when it comes to labor, it's always an increasing cost, and it makes it even, along with health and welfare and pension, so hard to manage. And I think that's one of the things that we should be, in my mind, I feel like we should be informed as much as possible, because that's something that's always a cost, and it's always increasing, and it's a huge part of everybody's budget, small business, big business, even government.
That's a great point, Supervisor. If we get direction from the board and the board requests, we can do annual updates on CalPERS. As it is right now, they're not hitting their return on investments, which then affects our unfunded liability, which as employers, we see an increase. Employees don't receive an increase. Prospectively, miscellaneous employees pay 7%, PEPRO 7.25, and then safety employees pay 9%, which is a little bit lower than our surrounding areas. However, any increases to CalPERS pension obligations are then paid by the employer, and we are seeing about a 7% increase from year to year on pension costs because of unfunded liabilities keep going up. With CalPERS not hitting their return on investments this last year, they weren't able to hit their discount rate or return on investment of 7, which seems pretty easy and manageable in the private sector, but CalPERS seems to not be able to hit those numbers on a consistent manner.
And just FYI for that, our next special board meeting is we're gonna go into depth with that. Our auditor's gonna cover that material for us, so.
Excuse me.
He's gonna cover the pension, OPEB, as well as teeter programming.
I was just going to mention, getting back to the number of employees and the 20% vacancy rate. It's interesting looking at that because I totally agree with Supervisor Gonzalez that, we certainly there's a lot of needs out there we need to fill. I know, for example, Public Works, tremendous need we've recently hired three new employees there, but we need more. And I know in other areas, certainly there's a great need. But when you have as high as 20, and you were talking about this, Gabriel, I think, as high as 20%, it does beg the question, is that a real number? And, is it really 20%, or, are the departments shooting high and it's not a real number? Because I think it's important that, it's working to our advantage right now in that we haven't had to let people, haven't had to lay people off during, that kind of a thing. But if it's not a real number, then it may work against you because you're projecting a certain amount of expenses for all those positions, and yet we may be better off having fewer openings, but be paying at a higher, allocating a higher amount of money for those positions, which would then help us fill those positions. So I don't know how all that works, but it just seems to me that's a real important thing to be looking at.
Thank you so much. Kind of a great lead in. If the PowerPoint presentation could be put back up, the employee request, can you put that up, Gabriel, or the back?
I think they gotta switch it.
Sorry about this.
I think we need like a little walkie-talkie
I
system.
know. We're gonna have to fix this.
We're
We're gonna have to do this internally here.
Yeah, but, addressing Supervisor Tiffany's, it's something that we
When
want to
you,
look at.
yeah, when you look at the bottom of this, future changes regarding vacancy budgeting, that is what we want to do.
Yep.
We want to be accurate. That's the point. We're getting at that point now where we don't have a lot of wiggle room, and we have to be accurate, and we really need to scrutinize the recruitment process and really analyze retention, as well as being able to recruit good people in our community. And that's going to be key. And in order to do that, we have to have accurate counts of and budgeting properly.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing that up, because I bring that up every year.
Yeah.
For the last 4 years, we've been, at 20%. So that's, to me, that's not a real number.
Right.
It's just
Yeah.
fiction.
Thank you.
All right, so I know in light of timing, we still have a decent presentation from our RMA director. Let's just I would skip this OPEB. We're going to cover this in detail
With the next presentation, next meeting, so.
Yeah, the OPEB trust, you can go ahead and read through that. The OPEB trust balances, CalPERS update. Let me just make sure there's nothing in here that's crucial.
Yeah, the only thing I'm gonna mention on the CalPERS is, like Edgar mentioned, they shoot for around the 7% return. To date, this year, they're about 3.6%, so they're probably gonna miss it again, like they have been doing historically the last couple of years, so.
So guess what happens?
Then what
What's
happens
on is
is-
back on us,
Yeah,
and it makes it even harder. And that number becomes even greater. And that's ultimately what's been happening over the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
Really.
and this is just to maintain the different kind of pension plans, funded through status quo pretty much. Increase the very marginal amount, but maintain status.
Okay. And then we have their pension impact. I think you already highlighted that. And then the budget policies, which we'll bring back, I think, a detailed list for your board, and go over that. So we have, the next one is capital projects.
Yeah, so the next one, kind of ending off the day here for my budget presentation, kind of leading the way off into RMA and their presentation coming up. Looking at, capital projects, a little bit on the overview of different projects that we've done this current year and some that we're looking at doing in this coming year. For example, RMA is going to be focusing a little bit more on the health and safety improvements, ADA compliance. What these kind of amount to is about 15 projects or about $1 million. All these different projects we're going to be looking at to make sure that they can be sustained projects within the county budget, to make sure that we can account for all of them. For the, like the slide kind of here mentions, we had a total of 26 CPI submissions from all the departments on different projects, whether if it's a remodel or looking at potentially doing their improvement or something within their facilities. We have a couple of project lists that we have here that we want to make sure that we address in some areas of concern, whether regarding some air conditioning, improving some pathways and fire exits. A lot of these items I know were brought to the board when they did the master facilities plan back in January, where I think it was January or February when they did a master plan overview of the different kind of facilities they were wanting to do in the county. My last slide here that I have is an update on roads and bridge project. There are 10 roads and bridges that are scheduled to be completed. That includes SB 1 Union Bridge and Buena Vista Highway 156. Which is a really huge accomplishment, and this is another area where it kind of shows where those kind of one-time expenses that we're showing in the budget, where some of them that aren't tied to any specific fundings. For example, SB 1 or Measure G, where are they coming from? Well, they're coming from the general fund to back up some of these expenses. In 2021-22, we have 9 HPB-funded bridge projects and no less than 20 other projects that we're looking to put together. And on the last little graphic here, we have a example of Measure G funding that is going to some specific projects. For example, Wright Road in Buena Vista, Shore Road to Highway 25, San Felipe, Cienega Road to Birch Creek Bridge, and Cards Avenue Bridge. So a lot of these different projects, and I wanted to kind of highlight some of these and let the board know that these do have an impact on the budget, and it's something that we do monitor. And in order to make the best use of the resources that we have available in the county, we are going to kind of look through them and see, if some of these projects do not have other funding attached, whether it's BSB 1 or Measure G, kind of prioritizing which ones are we going to be looking at moving forward.
And then one thing to add is we've invited Mary Gilbert, COG Director, to come to a future board meeting to discuss Highway 25 and 156. So she'll be highlighting some of the work that she's doing along with funding those projects for your board. With that, Mr. Chair, if I may request that we hear item number 1 and 2 together, if that's
Yes, sir.
okay.
No
Thank you.
problem.
Thank you. I'd like to go ahead now, and thank you, Gabriel, for all your work and time on this. I'd like to invite up our RMA Director, Benny Young, and he'll be presenting the CIP roads and give you an update. Benny?
Great, thank you. Mr. Chair, members of the board, Benny Young, Resource Management Agency Director. And I have with me today Michael Chambliss, the Assistant Director of the RMA, and also Karen Gumman, who's our Capital Projects Manager, recently acquired within the last few months. And she's jumped right in and helped organize a lot of this, and I wanted to thank her for the presentation that she was kind enough to put together for us this morning. And she's doing a terrific job of getting up to speed with regard to San Benito County. What I wanted to do today, or what we wanted to do rather, is just give you an overview, not necessarily delve into the details, but let you know that we are planning to bring a recommended capital improvement program to you for inclusion in the budget process, and by the time you have your special meeting on May 18th, that should be in final form for recommendation to you. What we're going to talk about today is kind of in a, just view it as a draft, preliminary, subject to modification prior to finalization, and at the end we'll talk about some things that you might want to do to give us your thoughts before we finalize our recommendation for inclusion in the formal budget process. I think it's been a while, I'm not sure how long Mr. Espinosa would know, since there's been a formally adopted capital improvement program brought forward by the Resource Management Agency, but I happen to believe that it's a really important tool for both you and the citizens of San Benito County to create a realistic expectation with regard to what is likely to be constructed under the capital improvement program in the next 5 years. And so the other thing I would say is, please look at this as a one-year definite. What we want to show you is what our best estimate of what we will actually complete in year 1, and view years 2 through 5 as tentative. And then next year, when you update the CIP, the year 2 will move forward and be adjusted. It becomes the 1-year definite, 4-year tentative. So it's always a work in progress, and it's never etched in stone. It's always subject to modification and change depending on the will of the citizens and your board. We're going to cover both roads, bridges, and facilities, and you may recall that we came to your board on February 16th and presented kind of a grim summary in some ways of the unmet needs that exist in both program areas, both road, bridges, and facilities. And the capital improvement program that we're going to present to you today and then finalize also has a certain grim reality associated with it, because the needs here are much greater than the present resources allow us to be able to address. And that's just the reality that we're working in, and it's not unusual or limited to San Benito County. I've been in the public works profession for almost 47 years now, and I can't remember a time other than maybe very early on in my career when I thought we had enough funds to take care of the community's needs. But it just requires us to make thoughtful recommendations to you for your final decisions with regard to what we would focus our investment capacity on. So thank you for allowing us to talk a little bit this morning. We have also given you, and I apologize to those online because they won't be able to see it yet, but eventually this will be online in the form of the final recommended CIP, a book that I hope is at your station or you've been provided, that kind of shows our work in progress with regard to the capital improvement program that we would bring forward to you in a similar form to this in May for your final decision. And key pieces of this include a spreadsheet that you will see fairly early on that pardon me for waving this at you, but it looks like this. It kind of shows the program at a glance. We wanted to show you the program at a glance with the principal funding sources and program categories, and then the detail follows. And each project will eventually have its own project sheet, so you can see exactly what's being planned for that particular project. So it's not just a line on a piece of paper with a very simple, broad description. And Karen is still pulling all that together for us, the detail sheets. So that should also be considered a work in progress. So you have a spreadsheet like this that precedes the road bridges component, and you also have one that looks kind of like this that leads into the facilities section of the recommended, or the CIP that we're working on. Okay. Pardon me for waving my paper around. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you all know the Resource Management Agency is a broad umbrella agency that covers a lot of functions. There's roughly a dozen functions under the Resource Management Agency. And we summarized this for you February 16th, and just briefly again, we have about 450 miles of roads that we're responsible for here, 51 bridges, and there's a variety of funding sources that are used to fund that program. In simple terms, what we're presenting to you this morning is just the funds that are controlled by San Benito County. So it's not the total regional picture, but I'm so thankful that the county administrator has invited Mary from the COG to speak to you, I think he said at the next meeting, to give you a perspective from the regional COG program, because there are projects that you won't see in here that are in the regional COG. The projects you see in what we're presenting to you are just the ones that we control the funding on. And so in general terms, it's kind of 3 or 4 major sources. One is Measure G, which comes to us through the COG, but we have a defined share of the Measure G funds. And then SB1, that's from the 12-cent gas tax that was raised by the state in 2017, and it's kind of the county share. In very simple terms, we get about $3 million a year over the next 5 years for Measure G, from Measure G each year. And we get about $2 million a year from SB1, so about $5 million from those, and those are the biggest funding local funding sources. The bridge program kind of has a life of its own, and most of that's funded by the federal government through the Highway Bridge Program. So those are the early projects that you'll see covered in the capital improvement program list and on that spreadsheet that I showed you. There's some emergency repair money, not a lot, and we're still waiting for the state to include us in the statewide declaration. That is still on the governor's desk and no decision has been made yet. We checked again yesterday. And so you'll see some projects that don't show funding, show a need but no funding, and one of them, for example, is New Idria Road, which washed out completely in the January floods. We know we need about $2.4 million to do that project, but we have not been able to identify any funding yet because it depends on the state declaration. Other funding sources include our enterprise funds. Those are the funds that come to us by virtue of the landfill agreement that we can use for roads that feed into and out of the landfill area. And there's a couple of ongoing projects that we'll mention briefly this morning on Best Road and Fairview Road that are being funded with enterprise funds. The last category of significance for us is our traffic impact fees, and those are regional traffic impact fees, and we have a couple of projects that we're funding partially out of traffic impact fees, and then some of our bridge projects that require a local match we're funding through the traffic impact fees because those bridges are of regional significance, like Union Road and Hospital, which is presently under construction. So that's kind of a broad overview of what we're about to step through with you this morning. First of all, I just wanted you to know that, and I can't take credit for this, as I mentioned in February, but there's been a lot of great work done since Measure G passed in 2018. So over the last 2.5 years, there have been about, these next 3 pages summarize some of the completed work. I just thought you might be interested in that because I think it's a success story for San Benito County, and NV5, who's worked as program manager, deserves a lot of credit, and my predecessor, Harry Mavrogenis, for developing what was called the Quick Start program that came to your board in the fall of 2019 and authorized a lot of this work. There's been about 20, 20 projects completed worth about $10 million over the last couple years or so. I think that's quite an achievement. Moving forward, this is a summary of the roads of the bridge program, largely funded with highway bridge funds. So if you use this as an example, you can see the total cost is in column 1 for a particular bridge. If you were to look at a hospital road, for example, we need $6 million for that, and we're going to complete that, we hope, this current fiscal year, so that will happen during year 2021. And so you don't see any funds in the second, third, and fourth and fifth years for that project because it's going to be completed in year 1. If you take another example, Union Road Bridge, on the other hand, has some money in year 1, fiscal year 21-22, that's highlighted, $1.4 million, but the bulk of the expenditures will take place in subsequent years. And as Ray or someone mentioned earlier, some of these projects have to be programmed over multiple years because a bridge project, especially a major one like Union Road, can't be completed in one season because we have to lay off for the winter, as an example. So they're generally programmed over at least 2 years. I'm not going to go over every project in the program now. We'll have an opportunity to do that with you when we present the final CIP, or we can try to answer questions if you have them specifically this morning. The emergency repair program is sort of limited right now, but there's where, as an example, you see New Idria. We need about $2.4 million, and we've listed it as pending because we are waiting on the state's declaration. And right now, we have not been able to identify any funds to move forward with that project for either design or construction. I'm hoping that we can start to fill in the gap on at least the design portion of this before we send you the final recommendation that you will see in May, but right now we don't have funding identified. This next slide is a summary of our Measure G program, and in my view, it's kind of the one that has the most significance for the public because of the vote that took place in 2018 and the expectations that were created as a result of that vote. In general terms, I like to round numbers, so forgive me, but it's about $3 million a year, and we can count on that for the next 5 years. After that, though, there's about a 10-year hiatus when all the money goes to Highway 25. And I think that's one of the major challenges associated with this program is there's been some headway made on addressing some of the deferred maintenance needs here using SB1 and Measure G in particular. But we're not going to be able to continue that beyond this 5-year program unless something else were to change, like maybe get funding from the Federal Jobs Act that is likely to pass Congress this summer to plug some of the gaps on Highway 25, as an example. I don't think we can count on that, but it's something that we need to look into. Because if we can avoid that 10-year hiatus in local funds for the county to do deferred maintenance work, that's really our biggest need as a county organization, is to take care of deferred maintenance, in my view, on the 450 miles of roads. You may recall that I mentioned to you in February that right now, in my opinion, we have a $7 million gap right now every year for the next 10 years just to maintain the system at the current level, which, as you all know, is not acceptable. The average pavement condition index is only 37, and that's not acceptable, in my view, to us or to the public. So that's our biggest challenge, is how do we really start to move into addressing that deferred maintenance need. So we've allocated the Measure G funds and our recommendation that we're finalizing for you, and you can see some of your favorite projects are mentioned there, and they've seen them in the Quick Start program, so it's a continuation of that, basically. There are not any new projects represented here other than the ones that are associated with an emergency. We're building on the work that was previously done by my predecessor in NV5.
Benny, quick
sir.
question. You mentioned a minute ago the emergency, we're waiting on the emergency, federal emergency funds, whether we're going to receive any. Where do we stand on the, I know we're applying for these federal grants as well, for federal access or emergency access money. What's the timing on those grants again?
So if you look at that cover sheet that I showed you, you'll see a program category for grants. And there's several that are really important to us, and that's one of the glimmers of hope with regard to funding for our program. The one I think that you're asking about is called the FLAP program, Federal Lands Access Program. And our funding application for that is due in May, so we're putting the finishing touches on that, and we should be bringing that to you for your endorsement. But that's a federal program that supplies funds to work on roads that provide access to federal properties like Bureau of Land Management, or in our case, also a national park. So I'm feeling pretty optimistic about that program. It's being assembled right now. The other program that's really important to us that I sent a note to your board last week is the Highway Safety Improvement Program. Everybody calls it HSIP. So if I start using acronyms, please ask me to stop and ask what that is. But HSIP, that we just recently landed $1 million grant for repair of guardrail countywide. And so we'll be moving forward with the start of the guardrail repairs later on this current year. The next page shows you the SB1 program, the projects that we're anticipating. And again, view year one, the total project cost is in column 1, what we plan to do in year 2, matching the funds that we believe will be available, about $2 million from SB1. And then we continue the program over the ensuing 4 years after that. We haven't put projects in for year 5 yet, but we will before we bring you the final recommendation, because there's a lot of projects that don't have identified funding sources right now, and some of which are really important to the community and were sort of promised as part of the Measure G package. This is an important slide because it shows projects that we don't presently have funding for. And the ones that are highlighted in tan, Fairview, Fraser Lake, Nash, San Felipe, Southside, Union. Some work has been done on some of those, in particular Fairview and Southside and Union, but there's a lot more work to be done. Fairview in particular, there are several major segments of Fairview that we simply do not have funds to address right now. So I wanted you to see this. These are some projects, as a sampling of projects that we presently do not have funds identified for in the program that we're bringing to you, and yet they're really important to our citizens. And we show that federal land FLAP program that we're applying for, Supervisor, Tiffany, back to your question, as being one of the programs that we're hopeful.
Now, is there also a
Chair.
Stand by, Supervisor Hernandez. Go ahead, Mr. Tiffany.
Just quick follow-up on the federal grants. There's also another federal grant that's for emergency access roads, or is that part of the FLAP? In other words, like Panoche Road accesses the valley, Highway 5, and it's an emergency access, and I thought there was a federal grant potentially for that as well, or is that part of the FLAP as well?
I believe it's part of the FLAP, and it's one of the rationale that we're applying to make the grant look more attractive to the funding agency, which is a division of the Federal Highway Administration, a separate division.
Okay.
And the fact that they not only provide access to the national park and BLM, but they also provide emergency relief access for the Hollister community is a selling point with regard to that grant application.
Okay. Thank you.
I think Mr. Hernandez has a question.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Supervisor.
Benny, thank you. I had a question about, well, you mentioned Nash, but I know San Benito Street was supposed to be a key component, and I think it was supposed to start in the spring because of the, not just because of the road, but ultimately safety, and even the focus of the board to support that regional park. I mean, I know that was a big element of it. So I'm curious why I don't see that on there.
That's a great question, and I appreciate the questions, Supervisor. And maybe if you can show me how to move back in my slideshow, I can, I apologize for not knowing how to move back. Yeah, keep going. Thank you. Okay, one more. Okay. And you're just pushing this back button right there, okay?
Go back, that to go forward.
Okay. If you look at the Measure G summary, Supervisor Hernandez, you will see San Benito Nash to Union with an intersection. And we've estimated a total cost of $1.2 million. Regrettably, we don't have funds identified yet in the current year that we're entering into, but we have $200,000 identified in the second year to do the design work using Measure G. And then we've shown that we need to have when we get the detail sheet, you'll see that we're asking for participation from the city of Hollister and maybe even the school district with regard to the actual implementation of that. At one time, I was under the impression that we would have enough money to just move forward and build that. But based on our subsequent assessment of how much Measure G funds we actually have and can expect, that's not the case. And so it's a project that we need to do some more work on to find funds to move forward with that project in the nearer term than sometime in the next 5 years. I hope that's an adequate.
Yeah, I appreciate your response, Benny. It's definitely an issue because that was a priority. That was actually a conversation under the RMA director, Harry Mavrogenis, to prioritize that because of the regional park and the safety, and there's other issues there. But ultimately, that was supposed to be under the Quick Start program. That was the whole focus. When I was in those conversations, we even visited. I know that we had a walkthrough, every supervisor with, I think, our CAO and staff to talk about what priorities we wanted with those Measure G funds. And I know, so to a certain extent, what I'm hearing is District 3 is officially off the table to make sure that we address that, not just to the benefit of the road and the safety, but even that regional park and the focus on acquiring that property. All of that is basically hampered by taking this off. And I don't know where that decision was made, but I have an issue with it for sure.
Mr. Chair, if I may, Supervisor Hernandez, we've noted that, and we'll see if we can't deal with it a little better with the final draft recommendation for you. It'll sound a little bit like an excuse, but I just received this from our consulting team late last week, and so we've scrambled to put it in front of you. As I mentioned going in, you should view this as a draft program for now, and I do appreciate the board's feedback, and there might be a way that we could squeeze that in earlier to honor the previous commitment.
Yeah, Supervisor Hernandez, can you please set up a meeting with Ray and Mr. Young, and then you guys can work through the issues that we have at hand, please?
Will do, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chair, if I may add, and maybe this is a project, if we, I agree with Supervisor Hernandez that this should be a priority, and maybe it's a project that's sort of at the top of the list of potential projects in the event we do get additional funding or we decide to spend down our general fund reserve next year. Thanks.
Make sure that happens, Mr. Chair.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. One other road that, there's a lot that jump out, but Fairview Road, and I don't know, maybe there's a separate slide I didn't see, but I think Fairview Road is a real critical road, particularly given the issues with the landfill and the trucks on that road. And I see where there's some portions of Fairview Road that are being addressed. I also know there's potentially enterprise fund money. Anyway, I'm just curious about Fairview Road and whether there might be an opportunity to address more portions of Fairview Road with enterprise money in the near future.
Mr. Chair, Supervisor Tiffany, Mr. Espinosa, the slideshow doesn't reflect everything that's in the spreadsheet I've given you yet. So if you refer back to that, at some point, you'll see that there are enterprise funds allocated to Fairview Road. And there's a project that's actually been awarded already
Spring.
to Granite Rock that'll be constructed starting in the next month or so for McCloskey to Rosa Morada, excuse me. And so there's a $2.4 million investment in Fairview that's pending. It's already in the works. There are some other Fairview Road sections that we've included for SB1 projects in the second and third year of the program. So there will be continued work on Fairview. I'd like to be able to tell you that we're going to get to all of it, but we're not. So there's still a significant issue with regard to things that are needed that we are not able to fund with either SB1 or Measure G in the near term. But I appreciate the feedback.
Oh, thank you. And I know that we are addressing Best Road as well, just almost, that's
It's
coming up in
also
the next
underway.
month or two here.
Yes, sir. That one, that's part of the same contract. There's about $1 million going into Best Road starting this late spring and then continuing into fiscal year 2021. And it shows up on the overall spreadsheet. And I didn't attempt to, for this purposes of this discussion, to capture everything that's on the preliminary full list. But when we develop the final recommendation, you'll see it all. And I just wanted to present an overview today, but the feedback is helpful. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may ask, you had mentioned set up a meeting with Supervisor Hernandez and Benny, and I'd like to request if I can add another individual, basically our park ad hoc, and be Supervisor Colin Kosmicki as well.
Okay.
Because they're
No problem.
both on that, if I don't mind. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know there are a lot of questions. I understand that. Let me just finish this, if I may, Supervisor, and then we'll come back, and before we go into the facilities segment, we'll answer more questions on this. This next slide shows some of the grant funding that we have applied for and or received. In this case, you can see we received the guardrail replacement from the Highway Safety Improvement Program. We did not receive funding for those two intersections in this grant cycle, so we'll be reapplying for those in the next HSIP grant cycle. That's Fairview, Aquista Pace, Comstock, and Shore Fraser intersections. That's kind of an overview of the roads and bridges segment of the program. As I indicated, the biggest issue for me is what's not in the plan. And what's not in the plan is a result of the financial constraints that we have. And my biggest concern that I would relay to you, and I don't have a solution for it, is that after 5 years, Measure G goes away for 7 to 10 years. And we're going to lose some headway on dealing with our road deferred maintenance needs during that time. And we're presently not able to keep up because we need $7 million a year in addition to the roughly $5 million that we have through SB1 and Measure G right now, just to keep things at the current level. So there's a huge unmet need here. I guess there may be some reason for optimism and with regard to what the federal government might do with the jobs bill that Congress is talking about. The president announced yesterday that he'd like to get the first piece of that in place by Memorial Day. We'll see. But I do believe that Congress will pass a jobs bill. This is not the same as the coronavirus stimulus package that was recently passed. This is an infrastructure funding bill for the country. So we'll be taking a hard look at that and seeing if we can identify some opportunities for supplementing funds on projects that would have appeal under that. I'm not sure deferred maintenance will be huge in the federal funding bill, but maybe putting some funds into Highway 25 so that we can free up Measure G might be. Beyond that, pursuing grants is the other avenue that we need to fully explore on behalf of the citizens of San Benito County. If I may, I'd like to defer the balance of the presentation to Mr. Chambliss, and then he and I will be available to answer questions. Oh, I think maybe Supervisor Gonzalez, you had a question?
No, I just wanted to say, thank you very much for this binder, okay? Because I'm more of a visual learner. I need to see and feel the documents and make notes. And as you were talking rudely, I was looking through the pages, and I got through all the pages. I didn't read every single page, but it's something that I can go when someone calls me from my district and ask, hey, what's the plan? I can go and I can find it and I can point it out. I also appreciate you sending us electronic version too, because I just saved it on my desktop. And so I like to go back and point to the authority and the source, and it's just very comprehensive. Thank you. And as a newbie here on the board, it's going to be my little Bible that I'm going to be carrying around, so it's very much appreciated.
I thank you for that. Just realize it's a work in progress and just a draft right now.
And you also said it was a collective effort, so I appreciate that too. Okay, thank you.
Very well.
And just real quick on that, for me, hopefully at some point, I brought up the having a database of our roads available to the public so that they can sort of do the work themselves as well, or we can point them to, and I know we got a lot on our plate, so I'm not saying that's urgent, but at some point it'd be nice to have that online database of roads with maybe a PMI and maybe a general expectation of when work may or may not be done. Thank you.
Very well.
Any other questions?
I think what we'll do is I'll meet with Benny and his team to discuss that. I do know that they have a GIS layer of the PMI of districts, what your averages are, how many miles you have as well. But I think what we need to do is create a one-stop shop. Go to here, and then you can get all the information. I think that's what we need to work on. Thank you.
Any further questions? See none, we'll bring it back to Ray. No. Oh,
We got one last part.
Okay.
With Mike Chambliss. Mike?
Thank you.
Sorry about that, sir.
That's okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Board of Supervisors. I'm here to talk about the building component of the CIP plan. Really want to stress the hard work that Karen did. She went physically to the sites, met with our customers, our colleagues, got their requests. She went through the master plan that was created by Veneer and crunched all those numbers and looked at the priorities. And she was able to meet with the fire department and get their wish list for where are their biggest concerns in our system. So she combined those three items to generate these project lists. And I'm really grateful for the amount of work that she did, because it was a ton.
So what you're saying is she did everything?
Only if you like it. If you hate this, I did it all.
That's what I like about you.
We like it, thank you.
Told you I was going to tell them that. Okay, we have 2 completed capital projects this year. We're going to put it on paper that the behavioral health building will be completed this year, even though there's a minor phone issue that we're working through. Let's set back the move a couple weeks, but they are going to move here hopefully before May 1st. And the homeless shelter phase 3 is going to be completed this year with occupancy occurring. The jail also should be completed this year. I believe we just received information yesterday that the certificate of occupancy will be signed in June. So that also should be able to be added to this list. That's one of our in-process capital projects, the $28 million project, the expansion of the jail. And we're also working with Health and Human Services on the HEAP project for some tiny homes up at the migrant facility. This page represents our recommended plan. This was the project list I was discussing back in February when we presented the Veneer report, and I suggested that we needed to find $1 million to do some serious heavy lifting in health and safety and ADA improvements.
I don't want to run through all the projects, but as far as buildings go, they equate to foundation issues, probation, roof issues, this building, HVAC systems that are failed out of the Ag Commissioner's office, mold issues within the occupied jail we have now. There are some very significant issues. The fire department, their biggest concern is the old behavioral health building and the Health and Human Services building as a complex. That entire complex needs an appropriate fire alarm system where that meets code. Currently, there isn't one. When they were constructed, the code allowed them to be considered as two separate facilities. They are not. That's one structure. So that work needs to occur, and unfortunately, that is expensive work. We're also recommending some ADA improvements, auto-opening doors at this facility and also over at the library. We've heard about the struggles that the library's customers have getting through those doors, and we think it's high time that we go ahead and install those automatic doors to ease people to get into their facility. These projects all total $985 million. And that is what we are $985,000. Sorry about that. And these are the ones, I'm expensive, sorry. These are the ones we're strongly pushing for to get funded for this year's work projects. Then we discovered something. Back in 2019, the grand jury recommended that the current jail facility have air conditioning installed. It is a health and safety issue. It's a health and safety issue for your employees along with the guests. That's a $2.4 million project. About $1 million of it's structural improvements to the roof to support the air conditioners. And then there's about a $1.4 million price tag on, I think it's 6 HVAC units that would need to be installed. Currently, there's an air exchange apparatus that does not work at all, according to Captain Bradley out at the jail. They take temperature readings in the jail in the summertime in excess of 110 degrees on a regular basis. This is a significant issue. It's also a significant amount of money, and I'm hoping at some point we can find that money so we can address this issue.
Question for you on that one.
Yes, ma'am.
So since we're talking about the existing jail, in terms of population, won't the majority of them be housed in the new facility once that opens and you get the certificate of occupancy? Won't that, and then how is the old facility going to be used? I'm just looking at it, expenditures on a archaic building where we have a new building that's ready to be occupied.
I'm not familiar enough with the Sheriff's Department's operational plans, but as far as I know, the plan is to utilize both facilities in perpetuity. So these improvements are necessary.
Yeah, and the old facility is hot. I taught in there for 2 years, and it gets really humid and muggy, and it's very uncomfortable in the heat in the summertime, and it's stagnant air. So I would agree with that. Yeah.
You can come back. Thank you.
You don't have to raise your hand, you just come on up.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to work here, and I'm enjoying it greatly. I just wanted to assist, and because I did ask Captain Bradley that information, and he is truly the best to speak to the experience, but to share about the occupancy plans, there's the jail, and the expansion is kind of nicknamed the new jail, but the jail will remain for maximum security, where residents stay in their jail for a significant part of the day. So that's the concern with the air exchange.
Thank you.
And the expansion is a rehab center, but everyone starts.
Rehabilitation center.
Correct.
A little bit different, yeah.
And everyone starts in the existing jail facility.
And I know with realignment that we have the inmate population, where years and years ago, it used to be where 365 days was the maximum we can house an inmate because of the way the criminal code was. But now, because of realignment, we are housing inmates there for years and years. And so, not that we need to make their stay comfortable, but at least the ability to be able to exist without much inconvenience. So, thank you.
This is a list of projects that currently we're working on. We've identified some funding for some of them. We have not identified all the funding quite yet. We have child support services, which is a funded project. We're going to be modifying the old behavioral health building to accommodate them as their permanent home. There is some funding available to do some improvements for the Office of Emergency Services. The fire department has requested to use fire impact fees to occupy a facility that's becoming available at the municipal airport. This could be a much less expensive project to have a final permanent home for Fire Station Number 3, at which point then we could re-examine our intentions for the property that was acquired for Fire Station Number 3.
Let's just clarify that the board has never made any type of obligation to that fire station. It never came to the board, and the board has no knowledge of it whatsoever. So I just want to be in public stating that.
I'm sorry, I thought you bought the property on Rosa Morada.
No, I'm speaking of the one at the fire station,
I was
or the one
talking
at the
about
airport.
Rosa
Yeah,
Morada.
the Rosa Morada, we bought it. That's the one we still, the intention is still there. It was voted on, it passed. I'm speaking of the fire station at the airport.
I was speaking about Rosa
Okay,
Morada.
I just want to make sure we're all on the same page.
No problem. We weren't. The Health and Human Services needs shower improvement and some more heat housing. They do have funding. The jail needs a new walk-in freezer, which we may have located a grant opportunity for, and some sewer vent pipes need to be replaced, which we're hoping to use jail impact fees to do. And we would like to do some RMA office improvements funded by the Integrated Waste Fund to go ahead and get them housed all in one work unit where it'll be easier for them to be productive, because currently they're kind of spread throughout our facility and there's some inefficiencies due to their office locations, and we're kind of full, so we need a little extra room. Unfunded projects on this list are the roof at the RMA needs to be repaired. Some money was budgeted this year, but it wasn't enough when the bids came in. There's a roof out at Public Works. There's a roof at the Sheriff's Training Center that all need improvements. And we also are trying to find funding to put a document control process in at RMA. For years, it appears people have just been boxing paperwork and putting it in the corner. And it's time to dig in and get that resolved. Looking out 3 years, we're hoping to address the Ag Commissioner's exterior envelope, which means siding, windows, roof. It has failed. Veneers recommending replace on all. We're hoping to do the structural repairs for the District Attorney's Office. We'll know more about that when we get the structural report back that we're requesting the funding for this year. There are a couple projects that were recommended by Veneer to make the library a little more usable. They total about $3.5 million. We're hoping to be able to do that. And we also need to replace the exterior envelope on the Public Works building out at the yard. That's also windows, siding, roof. And then this says year 4. It really is looking out 5 years. There are some issues over at the old courthouse hall of records, asbestos, lead paint, et cetera, that need to be abated. We are looking at doing some interior improvements to the juvenile hall. And we're still trying to determine whether or not we own a fiber cable that goes out to the south side yard or not. And if we don't, we would like to go ahead and run fiber out to the south side yard to get us off charter.
We can talk about that later. I don't-
Okay, I was gonna say, how
I'm
much
pretty
is that?
sure we do own that. There's a dark fiber there that is connected to that building, but we could talk about that after.
No problem. And that ends the building component. Now, there's a big section that's missing from our presentation today. And the data just strictly does not exist. So you will see a funding request in our operating budget for the CSAs and CFDs to go ahead and fund the engineering studies that are necessary to give us the data to create a CIP program for the CSAs, CFDs. That will allow us to have programmed improvements going on in the CSA, CFDs going forward. It will also allow us to do the budget work so we can perform the necessary 218 processes to make sure that everything is funded.
Okay, any questions for Mike?
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
The library, the $3.5 million, how does that sort of intertwine with I know we don't have a plan or anything for a new library, but I'd be hesitant to spend $3.5 million on something that we're only going to potentially use for a few more years and then spend another several $1 million on because $3.5 million can go pretty far on the new library, especially if we're talking about the potential for the renovation at the current site. So,
As Director Young said, remember, the first one is the one we're really looking
Yeah.
at. Years
Okay.
3 and 5 are really wish list items. We have no funding identified for any of it. And that's a lot of funding to come up with.
and then second, I'm sorry, Ray.
I was just going to highlight that I think there's still some opportunity there if we do not build a brand-new building or do not relocate them. There's, I think, opportunity there to expand, and we can address logistically maybe the Office of Ed and putting them somewhere else. But that we haven't talked to them about it. We're just, I think at this point it's as Benny and Mike had mentioned, it's kind of off in the future. There's other things that Nora and I have been discussing is addressing and talking to our legislature, the Assemblyman Rivas and the Senator Caballero on possibly finding some funding for us as well, or carrying a bill as well to offset these numbers. So hopefully that kind of helps a little bit, Supervisor Kosmicki.
Yeah, thank you.
A general question, because I know this has come up before. You mentioned possibly looking for funding for a library. We talk about, looking for grants in other areas. Have we considered, the county considered having a grant writer on staff? I know within each department, people are writing grants, but I just, with all the openings, again, that could be a real, it could be, financially make a lot of sense in terms of what could be potentially out there and what we would be spending. I'm curious whether we've ever had one and whether we should consider that.
One thing you can do is we can direct our lobbyist to work on that, because I have a couple friends that are lobbyists, and in their division, they always have grant writers. So the firm we have might have a grant writer, and we can actually, the way I would look at it is pay to play. They get the grant, they get a certain percentage or whatever it is.
One thing I'd like to also mention, just I think it's a great idea. It's one of the first things that we did, or I did when I first came on board, is looking at that and looking at opportunities. Health and Human Services hires a contracted grant writer. He does a lot of grants, very familiar on how to write grants and receive grants. I know that RMA many years ago went ahead and applied for grants, and they applied for all of our bridges. But this is the the key point, to be very careful when we apply for those grants, because there could be an obligation on the general fund. It also needs to be done within a certain period of time. And then that causes problems. And when we have 10 bridges that we've actually had some concerns with, I think we had to pull 1 or 2 off. I'm trying to remember now, but basically that has been kind of a little bit of an issue because there were so many grants or so many bridges that were applied for through the grant process that I think it was a lot of staff time, a lot of work. It was way more than we can actually address and deal with from an employee perspective. And so that causes a lot of delays, a lot of issues. Now we had issues with Caltrans because we weren't reporting timely enough. There was also obligation on the general fund. So there's just a lot of things when we do hire a grant writer or we go through that process, there has to be a lot of scrutiny as well, managing those grants and making sure that we can accomplish what those requirements are within that grant. They're all different. So hopefully that helps.
That is one of the benefits of a CIP program, because it kind of gives us focus. These are the projects we're working on, so we're not just doing a shotgun approach to grants.
And Mr. Chair, I agree with both Supervisor Tiffany and Chairman Medina, and I think there could be a lot of value, a lot of return on investment from a grant writer. Another consideration might be, and this is obviously a whole separate thing, but setting up an incentive program for the grant writer. So maybe it's not a percentage of, if we get a $30 million grant, then we're stuck with a $3 million bill or something for the grant writer. We might set up incentives and steps in that sort of a contract so that we're not, being sort of burdened with the potential for. Yeah, right.
Yep.
Yeah, no.
Any further questions? See none, we'll bring it back to the board. Any parting?
I would have
Statement?
one parting word, if, with your indulgence, Mr. Chair.
Of course.
I just wanted to thank the board for your patience with us today. It's kind of a complex program with a complex funding mix. And we're sort of to the point where we understand it, and but we may not be communicating it as clearly as we'd like to. But we will take the comments that you've made today seriously. I'm particularly moved by Supervisor Hernandez's comment on San Benito Street and finding a way to get that in what we bring to you for a final recommendation. And I've already been looking at our spreadsheet, and I think I may have a way to do that the board would be acceptable to the board. So I believe that we can incorporate that in the final recommended CIP for you. And I just appreciate the feedback and the time. If you have other thoughts on this, feel free to get them to Mike or me. By the end of next week would be ideal, because I think we have a deadline to re-enter our final recommendations, at least by the end of this month. That doesn't mean it's cast in stone even then, because it's still your program and you get to adopt and make tweaks to it, as the county administrator mentioned, in May, before you adopt it finally in June. So if a project that you have a particular concern for is not in here, please put it on the table with me, and we'll do our best to address the issue.
Mr. Chair, if I may say a couple of words as well. I'd want to thank your board for spending the day with us. I want to echo those same words. We've heard where you'd like to, address some of our key areas from a normal budgeting process with roads, staffing, addressing the vacancies, and a few other things, policy. So those are the things we're going to take back, and we'll come back to you in May and highlight some of those things and bring back some information, some data that your board requested. So thank you.
Mr. Chair, I just want to thank, I know there's tremendous amount of work put in on this, and Gabriel, great job, and I know you're just on board, so congratulations and great presentation. And Benny, I think this is, I know Supervisor Gonzalez already mentioned this, but I mean, a tremendous amount of work was put into this this book here. I know it's a work in progress, but it's really impressive and really helpful. I just wish we had the money to do all this, but anyway, thank you for all your efforts. And I have an afternoon that I didn't think I was going to have free, so I assumed this was going all day. So thank you for that as well.
We call that the gift of time, yeah, so thank you.
Any further statements?
Mr. Chair, I also just want to thank the staff and really appreciate all the work that went into this. I think we're on, this is a first step toward hopefully a really successful budget, and so really thank you all.
Okay, well, is there a motion for adjournment?
Open to the public, just public
I'm
comment.
sorry. Public comment?
And I have some final thoughts also, Mr. Chair.
Pardon?
Just a final thought.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Peter.
Okay, well, I appreciate all the work that was put in. I know that it takes a lot of work. I know that, when it comes to budget, there's so many variables, but long and short, so I appreciate all the hard work, and my only other final comment is really to tread lightly with this game plan, because when I think about what the funds are that are coming in, it's the rescue plan, and as an example, it's debt, and I'm worried about the inflation that we're going to be dealing with, which is going to be something that we're either going to have to manage right now, or we're going to find ourselves in a shortfall. And ultimately, I'd hate to ever be in a position to let people go. So those are just my parting thoughts. That revenue generation should be, I think, which I know it is the focus for us as a county in order to move forward successfully. Those are my final thoughts. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Now we'll open it up for public comment. Thanks for reminding me, Ray.
If you're on Zoom and would like to make a comment, please press the raise your hand icon on your screen or *9. You've been unmuted. Please state your name and you have 3 minutes.
Elia Salinas, thank you, Mr. Chair and Supervisors. I just wish that more of your constituents would understand and come and listen to this, or hopefully later on they will look at the video, because the complaints from the constituents is that you spend money, and we know you spend money, but they don't know how your money is spent. And you all, as an entire board and as your staff, you try to do the most diligent job that you can do and be as conservative. I know you're not, it's not carte blanche. So I want to thank the board, because you do make decisions, and sometimes you agree and sometimes you don't agree, and you have to make the decisions that are not popular, but they have to get done. And spending money is very important. We are a very poor county. I say that numerous times throughout meetings, and this is a prime example of what it costs to run this county. Again, I will state that the Board of Supervisors, the position of a supervisor, should be a full-time job, because it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of research. Going through that binder today, you didn't go through it completely. If this was your full-time job, you'd have the time to get dedicated to be able to do this. So I strongly encourage the board to review among yourselves, and I think that there's a study out there about trying to get the position for a full-time supervisor, because it's really important. This is a business that it must be done right, it must be done accurately, and it can't be done on being able to get a report, and there's more to it. And if this was full-time, you'd have more time to find out what there is more to it. Again, this report also reiterates that we need economic development. We need to bring some money to this county. We need to bring businesses to the county, as well as tourism. And so I think those are my final words: economic development and work on tourism. And let's get the supervisors a full-time job, and let's make some money for San Benito County. So thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you, ma'am.
You've been unmuted. Please state your name. And you have 3 minutes.
Susan Logue, Board of Supervisors. Thank you so much for this presentation. I've really learned a lot. And like Elia said, it's amazing what you have to deal with the restrictions. And I really appreciate the RMA giving me such a great presentation. Regards to the library, I so appreciate that they're going to help make the doors more ADA accessible. That's great news. And I'm assuming probably the bathrooms are going to be included in this, as that would be another need there. As you well know, we've had some issues with the library's bathrooms over the years, and it's being used, once they open up, it's going to be used more and more and more. So that's just kind of an area Nora and I have talked about before. I'm sure she's mentioned that to you, and it just seems kind of a big need for the library. So thank you so much for your time, and you guys have enjoy the rest of your day.
Any further comments?
You've been unmuted. Please state your name and you have 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. This is Valerie Eglin with Reach San Benito Parks Foundation, and it has truly been enlightening. And not that I haven't been quite aware of the budgeting over the last number of years, but I think this year the presentation really delineated the shortfalls and the pluses, the advantages, the granting, the state regulations, federal, to help the citizens of San Benito County understand where our money comes from and where it's going, and to better support each supervisor in their district in providing for the possibility of funding for all the projects that they're advocating for. With the parks, of course, it is always an issue with the Parks Foundation that we seek and advocate for the funding of the parks for the health and welfare of the county population. And so I'm seeing hope there that we will be moving forward with our regional park perhaps, and all of the parks helping to implement the safety and facilities at each one of them for our population. So thank you very much for the presentation. I agree with Elias Salinas that it would be wonderful if more people could find time in their day to just listen in on their phone to the board presentations. It is truly wonderful to watch Espinoza working his magic on the organization of these presentations. So thank you very much, Ray. You have a great day and a wonderful afternoon, everybody. I'll enjoy that too. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
No more comments.
Bring it back to the board. Now, is there a motion for adjournment?
I move that we adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 5-0.